Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw him, I convinced myself it was just another hitchhiker trying to catch a ride out of the Louisiana backwater. That was 3 weeks ago, and I've been telling myself lies ever since. The elevated highway cuts through the Atchafalaya Basin like a concrete scar, rising 20 feet above the cypress swamp that stretches endlessly in every direction. During the day, the road feels like salvation, a thin line of civilization suspended over primordial darkness. But at night, when the fog rolls in from the Gulf and the Spanish moss hangs like burial shrouds from the ancient trees, that same highway becomes something else entirely. It becomes a bridge between worlds I'm not sure I want to understand. I've been making this drive for 6 months now, commuting from my apartment in Lafayette to the industrial complex near Morgan City, where my company contracted me for a year-long project. The work hotel sits on the edge of the swamp, a squat concrete building that looks like it was dropped there by accident and forgotten. Most nights, I'm the only guest, which suits me fine. The isolation helps me focus, or at least that's what I kept telling myself, until the man in the wool coat appeared. The road follows a gentle curve just past mile marker 47, where the swamp presses closest to the highway, and the cypress trees form a tunnel of shadow even in daylight. It was there, on that curve, that I first spotted him in my headlights. A figure standing motionless on the shoulder, one arm raised in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking passage to somewhere else. What struck me as odd wasn't the hitchhiker himself, but his clothing. Even from a distance, I could see he wore a heavy wool coat, the kind designed for New England winters, not Louisiana's oppressive humidity. The coat appeared to be dripping, as if he'd been standing in the rain, though the night was clear and cloudless. I didn't stop. I never stop for hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere at 11:30 at night. But as I passed him, something happened that made me grip the steering wheel tighter and press harder on the accelerator. The air inside my car suddenly filled with the sharp, oceanic smell of brine, salt water and seaweed and something else, something organic and wrong. At the same moment, my rearview mirrors began fogging up from the inside, as if my breath had suddenly become visible in the air-conditioned cabin. I cranked up the AC and cracked the windows, but the smell lingered for another mile before gradually fading. When I checked my mirrors again, they were clear, showing nothing but empty road stretching back into darkness. The second encounter happened exactly 1 week later. Same time, same place. I'd been thinking about the previous incident all week, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe the AC had malfunctioned. Maybe I'd driven through some industrial runoff that had evaporated from the road surface. Maybe the humidity had condensed inside the car in some unusual way. I'd nearly convinced myself of these logical explanations when I rounded the curve at mile marker 47 and saw him again. Same spot, same heavy wool coat, same dripping appearance, same raised arm. This time, I was ready for the smell, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any less disturbing. The brine scent hit me like a physical blow, so strong I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The mirrors fogged instantly, but this time I noticed something else. The fog had texture to it, swirling in patterns that reminded me of tidal pools stirred by an unseen hand. I kept driving, but slower this time, watching in my side mirror as the figure receded into darkness. For just a moment, I thought I saw him turn to watch my taillights disappear, though from that distance it was impossible to be sure. When I reached the hotel, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, engine running, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was the same homeless person, seeking rides at the same time each week. Maybe he had mental health issues that made him stand out in inappropriate weather gear. Maybe the smell was coming from the swamp itself, some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But the other part of my mind, the part that still believed in things that couldn't be explained by science or reason, whispered different possibilities. That part reminded me of the stories my grandmother used to tell about the spirits that haunted Louisiana's waterways, the souls of those who drowned in the Gulf and couldn't find their way home. I pushed those thoughts away and went to bed, but sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of dark water and reaching hands, of voices calling from beneath the surface of the swamp. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat that smelled faintly of salt water. The third encounter changed everything. I'd spent the intervening week researching the area around mile marker 47, digging through old newspaper archives and historical records. What I found did nothing to ease my growing anxiety. The stretch of highway had been built in the 1980s over what was once a thriving Cajun fishing village called Petite Coeur. The village had been abandoned in the 1960s after Hurricane Betsy devastated the area, washing away homes and businesses and claiming several lives. The storm surge had been so powerful it had literally erased the settlement from the map, leaving only the cypress trees to mark where families had once lived and worked. Most unsettling of all, I found a newspaper article from 1965 describing the aftermath of the hurricane. Among the missing was a fisherman named Thomas Boudreau, last seen trying to secure his boat as the storm approached. His body was never recovered, but witnesses reported seeing him wearing his distinctive wool peacoat, a gift from his brother who'd served in the Merchant Marine. Armed with this information, I approached the curve at mile marker 47 with a mixture of dread and determination. I told myself I would stop this time, would confront whatever was happening, and put an end to the mystery that was slowly consuming my thoughts. He was there, exactly as before. Same spot, same coat, same raised arm. But this time, as my headlights illuminated him, I could see details that made my blood run cold. The wool coat wasn't just wet. It was covered in dark stains that could have been mud or seaweed or something worse. His face, pale and gaunt beneath hair that hung in wet tangles, turned toward my approaching car with an expression of desperate hope. I slowed down, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to keep driving. The brine smell hit before I'd even come to a complete stop, so overwhelming that I retched into my hand. The mirrors fogged instantly, but this time the condensation ran down the glass in rivulets that looked disturbingly like tears. I pulled over about 50 yards past him and sat with the engine running, hands shaking as I tried to decide what to do next. In the rearview mirror, I could see him walking toward my car, his movements oddly fluid, as if he were underwater. Each step left a dark, wet print on the asphalt, and I could hear the squelch of waterlogged boots even through my closed windows. The footsteps stopped directly behind my car. I couldn't see him in the mirrors anymore. The condensation was too thick, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing against the rear of the vehicle. The smell of brine grew stronger, mixing with odors of decay and deep water that made my stomach churn. Then came the sound that nearly shattered my resolve entirely. A wet, desperate tapping on my rear window, rhythmic and insistent, like Morse code spelled out by drowning fingers. I gunned the engine and pulled back onto the highway, tires squealing against wet asphalt. In my mirrors, I caught a glimpse of him standing in the middle of the road, his arm still raised but no longer in a hitchhiker's gesture. Now it looked more like a farewell, or perhaps a warning. The footprints he'd left behind were clearly visible in my headlights, dark, wet impressions that seemed to steam in the humid air. But as I watched, they began to fade, starting from the back and working forward as if an invisible hairdryer were evaporating them one by one. Within seconds, they were gone entirely, leaving no trace that anyone had ever been there. That was when the radio started. Every night since then, as I approach mile marker 47, my car radio switches itself to channel 16, the International VHF Maritime Emergency Frequency. This shouldn't be possible. My car doesn't have a marine radio, doesn't even have the proper antenna to receive VHF signals. Yet every night, without fail, the digital display flickers from whatever station I'd been listening to and settles on 156, 800 megahertz. The broadcasts that come through are fragmented and disturbing. Sometimes it's standard Coast Guard chatter, weather reports and navigation warnings that seem routine enough. But other times, I hear things that make my hands shake on the steering wheel. Distress calls that sound decades old, broadcast in voices thick with Louisiana accents and rising panic, Mayday signals that cut off mid-transmission, and once, just once, a voice that whispered my name through the static, pronouncing it with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it by watching my lips move. I've tried changing the station, turning off the radio entirely, even disconnecting the antenna. Nothing works. The signal comes through anyway, as clear as if it were being broadcast from inside the car itself. The only way to make it stop is to pass beyond mile marker 48, where the transmission fades to white noise and then silence. I've considered taking a different route to work, adding an extra hour to my commute by following the back roads through Thibodaux and Houma. But something keeps drawing me back to that elevated highway, back to the curve where the cypress trees lean close, and the shadows seem deeper than they should be. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's some misguided sense of obligation, or maybe it's something else entirely, a compulsion I don't fully understand, planted by whatever it is that waits for me in the darkness. The worst part isn't the apparition itself, or even the impossible radio transmissions. The worst part is the growing certainty that he's not trying to hitch a ride at all. He's trying to warn me about something that waits ahead on the road I travel every night. Something that gets a little closer each time I pass by without stopping to listen. Last night, I made a decision that terrifies me, even as I know I have no choice but to follow through. Tonight I'm going to stop. I'm going to roll down my window and ask him what he wants, what message he's been trying to deliver from whatever watery grave holds his body. I'm going to listen to what the radio is really trying to tell me. The sun is setting now, painting the western sky the color of old blood. In a few hours, I'll be making that familiar drive through the darkness, approaching the curve at mile marker 47, where the boundary between the living and the dead seems thinner than paper. My hands are already starting to shake, and I can smell brine in the air, even though the nearest ocean is 50 miles away. I've written this account in case I don't come back, or in case I come back changed in ways I can't yet imagine. If you're reading this, if you found these pages, then you'll know what happened when I finally stopped running from the truth that waits in the Louisiana darkness. The radio is already beginning to crackle with static, though my car is parked and the engine is off. Channel 16 is calling, and somewhere in the distance I can hear the sound of wet footsteps approaching. It's time to go. Story 2. The humidifier clicks on at 2:47 a.m. I know this because I've been watching the digital clock on my desk for the past 3 hours, waiting. The soft mechanical whir fills our Detroit loft, and I feel my shoulders tense as the familiar mist begins to curl from the unit in the corner. My brother sleeps soundly in the bedroom across the hall, his breathing steady and undisturbed, while I sit hunched over my laptop in what we generously call the home office, really just a desk shoved against the exposed brick wall. The voice recorder app on my phone is already open, microphone active. I learned to be prepared after the first few incidents. Steam rises in ghostly spirals, catching the amber glow from the street lamp outside our fourth-floor window. Detroit's skeletal skyline stretches beyond the glass, all empty lots and broken promises, but tonight it feels different. Tonight it feels like something is watching back. The humidifier runs for exactly 11 minutes before shutting off with that same decisive click. In the sudden silence, I hold my breath and wait for what I know is coming. The notification appears on my phone screen. New voice memo recorded. My finger trembles as I tap play. Static fills the small speaker, then clears to reveal a voice that isn't mine, isn't my brother's, isn't anyone's I recognize. The words emerge from what sounds like great distance, as if spoken through water or thick glass. They need me. 3 words, always the same 3 words. I save the file with today's date, October 15th, the 7th recording this month, and add it to the folder that's been growing since September. 23 files now, each containing the same message, each appearing in the wake of the humidifier's mysterious cycles. Sleep feels impossible, so I return to the project that's been consuming my nights. Monitoring. The shortwave radio sits beside my computer, its analog face glowing green in the darkness. I've become intimately familiar with its frequencies, scanning through static and foreign broadcasts in search of answers that never come. But sometimes, when the atmospheric conditions align just right, I find something else. I adjust the antenna and begin the slow sweep across the bands. Most nights yield nothing but white noise and distant conversations in languages I don't understand. But tonight feels different. Tonight the air itself seems charged with expectation. At 88, 3 megahertz, the static clears. They need me. The same voice, the same words, but now delivered with the crisp authority of an airport announcement. I frantically adjust the tuning, trying to lock onto the signal, but it fades back into static before I can properly record it. The radio hums innocently, as if nothing happened. I push back from the desk and pace to the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor. The loft stretches around me, all open space and industrial fixtures that seemed so modern and urban when we first moved in 6 months ago. Now the exposed ductwork looks like metallic veins, and the shadows pool in corners with uncomfortable depth. A cup of coffee seems like a good idea until I realize my hands are shaking too badly to operate the machine safely. Instead, I lean against the counter and stare out at the city. Detroit at night has its own particular emptiness, a quality of absence that goes beyond simple darkness. It's as if the city is holding its breath, waiting for something to return that's been gone for too long. The whiteboard in the office catches my attention as I walk back past the doorway. We use it for project planning. My brother works in software development, and I'm a freelance graphic designer. But tonight something about its surface seems wrong. The overhead light is off, leaving only the ambient glow from my desk lamp to illuminate the space. But in the glass surface of the board, I can see a reflection that doesn't match the room. I step closer, my pulse quickening. In the reflection, there's a figure standing in the doorway behind me. Tall, impossibly tall, with straight hair that falls past her shoulders like a dark curtain. She moves with purposeful urgency, as if late for an important meeting, crossing the reflected space with long, swift strides. I spin around. The doorway is empty. The hallway beyond shows nothing but the familiar geometry of our loft, all clean lines and exposed brick. When I turn back to the whiteboard, the reflection shows only what it should. My own face, pale and drawn with exhaustion, and the accurate mirror image of the office behind me. My brother finds me there in the morning, slumped over the desk with my head pillowed on my arms. He shakes me gently awake, and I blink up at him through scratchy eyes. "You're doing it again," he says, not unkindly. He's younger than me by 3 years, but carries himself with a steadiness I've always envied. The insomnia thing. You need to see someone. I want to tell him about the recordings, about the radio transmissions, about the woman in the reflection who moves through spaces that exist only in glass. Instead, I mumble something about deadline pressure and stumble toward the shower. Under the hot water, I try to make sense of what's happening. The rational part of my mind offers explanations. Stress, sleep deprivation, the isolation of working from home. But rationality feels thin when I remember the clarity of that voice on the recordings, the specificity of the woman's appearance in the reflection. The workday passes in a haze of design revisions and client emails. I find myself checking the humidifier obsessively, noting that it remains silent and still during daylight hours. Whatever triggers its nocturnal activity seems linked to darkness, to the quiet hours when the city sleeps, and the boundaries between real and imagined grow thin. My brother leaves around 6 to meet friends for dinner, and I'm alone again in the loft. The silence feels different now, charged with potential. I set up my equipment early, the shortwave radio tuned and ready, the voice recorder app open on my phone, a notebook to document any new patterns or details. As sunset bleeds orange across the Detroit skyline, I begin to understand that I'm not just observing these phenomena, I'm participating in them. The humidifier seems to sense my attention, responding to my vigilance with increased activity. The radio transmissions grow clearer when I'm actively listening. The woman in the reflection appears more frequently when I position myself to see her. The question that gnaws at me is whether I'm documenting something external or creating it through the act of observation itself. Quantum physics suggests that the observer affects the observed, that reality becomes fixed only when witnessed. But this feels different, more purposeful. This feels like communication. At 11:30 p.m., I make a decision that will change everything. Instead of simply waiting for the humidifier to activate, I approach it directly. The unit is unremarkable. White plastic, cylindrical design, digital controls that we've never programmed to run automatically. There's no timer set, no smart home integration that might explain its behavior. Yet as I kneel beside it, studying its innocent facade, I can feel something gathering in the air around it. I place my hand on its smooth surface and speak into the quiet room. "What do you need?" The response is immediate. The humidifier vibrates under my palm, warming as if suddenly infused with electricity. Mist begins to pour from its vents with unusual density, creating a fog that spreads across the floor like spilled milk. The vapor carries a scent I can't identify, something between ozone and lilac, clean but organic. My phone buzzes with a new recording notification, but this time I don't need to play it back to hear the message. The voice emerges directly from the mist, clearer than ever before. They need me to remember. Not they need me. They need me to remember. The distinction feels crucial, though I can't yet understand why. I grab the shortwave radio and begin scanning frequencies, driven by an urgency that borders on desperation. The voice has given me something new, a fragment of meaning that suggests purpose rather than simple repetition. At 94.7 MHz, I find it, a transmission that doesn't sound like the usual airport announcement. This time the voice is conversational, almost intimate, as if speaking directly to me across the static. The others forget too quickly. Buildings change, people leave, but the stories remain. Someone has to remember what happened here, what this place was before it became empty. The signal fades before I can respond, leaving me alone with the humidifier's gentle whir and the growing certainty that I'm part of something larger than I understood. The loft around me no longer feels like simply our apartment. It feels like a repository, a place where memories gather like mist. I spend the remaining hours before dawn researching the building's history. Public records reveal its past. A textile factory in the 1940s, later converted to artist studios in the 1980s, then renovated into loft apartments after the economic collapse. But between the official dates and transactions, I find gaps. Periods where the building stood empty, where something happened that left no paper trail. The woman in the reflection appears just before sunrise, and this time I'm ready for her. I position myself at the whiteboard and watch as she moves through the reflected space with that same urgent stride. But now I notice details I missed before. She's carrying something in her hands, papers or documents that she clutches protectively against her chest. Her mouth moves as if she's speaking, though no sound emerges from the reflection. I press my face closer to the glass, trying to read her lips, and for one impossible moment our eyes meet in the reflection. She stops walking and stares directly at me, her expression shifting from urgency to something like relief. She raises one hand and points at the document she carries, then at me, then at the space around us. The meaning is clear. She's been trying to show me something, to pass along information that exists only in the spaces between real and remembered. When my brother returns the next evening, he finds me surrounded by printouts and research notes. I've been awake for 36 hours, driven by a conviction that I'm close to understanding. "You look terrible," he says, settling onto the couch across from my makeshift command center. And this is getting out of hand. I try to explain, to share what I've discovered about the building's history and the gaps in the records. But the words come out fragmented and obsessive, and I can see the concern growing in his eyes. To him, I must look like someone succumbing to paranoid delusion, seeing patterns where none exist. But that night, the humidifier reveals its final secret. It activates at exactly midnight, filling the loft with its familiar mist. But this time, the vapor doesn't simply spread randomly across the floor. It forms shapes, patterns that suggest meaning. I watch, transfixed, as the mist coalesces into rough outlines. A room layout different from our current configuration, furniture that isn't ours, shadows of people who aren't there. The recording on my phone captures more than just the voice this time. Behind the words, "They need me to remember," I can hear other sounds. Typing on an old typewriter, papers shuffling, conversations in the distance. It's as if the mist is showing me an echo of the building's past. A glimpse of the textile factory when it was alive with workers and purpose. The woman appears in the whiteboard reflection one last time. And now I understand who she is. Not a ghost or hallucination, but a memory made manifest. Someone who worked in this building decades ago, who witnessed something important enough to transcend ordinary forgetting. She's been trying to communicate not from beyond death, but from beyond time itself, carrying information that the building refuses to let disappear. As dawn approaches, I finally understand what they need me to do. Not just to remember, but to record, to document, to ensure that the stories held in these walls don't fade when the last witness dies or moves away. I begin to write, capturing everything I can recall about the woman's appearance, the patterns in the mist, the sounds buried in the static. My brother will think I've lost my mind, and perhaps I have. But sanity feels less important than preservation, less valuable than the stories that want to be told. The humidifier falls silent with its usual mechanical click, but this time it doesn't start again. The recordings stop appearing on my phone. The radio transmissions fade back into ordinary static. Whatever needed to be communicated has been received, and now it's my responsibility to ensure it survives. I sit in the pre-dawn quiet of our Detroit loft, surrounded by the evidence of my weeks-long obsession, and realize that I may never know if any of it was real in the conventional sense. But reality, I'm beginning to understand, is more flexible than I once believed. Memory and imagination, past and present, observer and observed, all blend together in the spaces where stories refuse to die. The city stretches beyond our windows, full of buildings with their own accumulated memories, their own voices waiting to be heard. And somewhere in the frequency between sleeping and waking, between forgetting and remembering, they're all saying the same thing. They need us to listen. They need us to remember. They need us to keep the stories alive. Story 3. The morning air carried the scent of rain-soaked concrete when I found it leaning against my apartment door like an abandoned secret. The familiar square outline, the pristine cellophane catching fluorescent hallway light, my heart hammered recognition before my mind caught up. This was the pressing I'd been stalking for months, the one that had haunted my dreams and emptied my savings account in failed bidding wars. Yet here it was, impossibly present. The sticker from Resonance Records clung to the bottom right corner, their distinctive burgundy logo unmistakable. I'd been in that shop just yesterday, fingers tracing the spine of this exact release, while the owner quoted a price that made my wallet weep. The irony wasn't lost on me. 24 hours ago, I'd walked away empty-handed, and now the universe had apparently delivered my obsession directly to my doorstep. My hands trembled as I carried it inside, the weight both familiar and foreign. Every collector knows that specific heft of virgin vinyl, the way an unopened record holds promises like a sealed letter from the past. The apartment felt different with it present, as though the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Under the harsh kitchen light, I examined every detail. The shrink wrap bore no tears, no evidence of tampering. The spine showed the characteristic fade patterns of the original pressing. Even the slight warp along the bottom edge matched the description from the online forums where devotees discuss this album with religious fervor. Everything checked out, yet nothing made sense. I should have called the shop immediately, should have driven across town to return what was obviously their property. Instead, I found myself peeling away the cellophane with surgical precision, the plastic crackling like distant static. The moment the wrap gave way, I heard it. A sound so subtle I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A soft exhalation, as if the record itself had been holding its breath for decades. The gatefold sleeve opened like a book of secrets, revealing the familiar artwork that had graced my computer screen during countless late-night research sessions. But touching it, Feeling the textured paper beneath my fingertips created an intimacy that digital images could never provide. The vinyl itself emerged with that satisfying weight, surface unmarked by the scratches and scuffs that plague most survivors from this era. Evening settled over the city like a heavy blanket by the time I finally lowered the needle. My turntable had never felt more ceremonial, the ritual of placement and adjustment taking on an almost religious significance. The familiar mechanical sounds of the cartridge finding its groove should have been comforting, but instead they seemed unnaturally loud in my suddenly quiet apartment. The first notes emerged exactly as expected, the gentle piano introduction that opened the album, crystalline and perfect. I settled into my listening chair, eyes closed, ready to experience something I dreamed about for years. The second track flowed seamlessly from the first, each note precisely where memory insisted it should be. Then came the anomaly. Where the third track should have begun, something else entirely filled my speakers. Strings, yes, but arranged in patterns I'd never heard on this album. The melody felt familiar yet impossible, like a half-remembered dream that refuses to solidify upon waking. My eyes snapped open, heart suddenly racing. This wasn't right. This track didn't exist. I knew this album, had studied it, had memorized every review, every track listing, every minute detail of its creation and release. What poured from my speakers was beautiful, haunting, and completely impossible. Yet I recognized it. The arrangement, the specific way the violins carried the melody while cellos provided counterpoint. I'd heard this before. Not on a recording, but in person. Yesterday, at Resonance Records, when I'd lingered too long near the listening booth where some customer was audiotioning equipment, the shop owner had been testing a new cartridge, playing fragments of various recordings to calibrate the sound. This had been one of those fragments, a brief snippet that had caught my attention before he moved on to something else. But that made no sense. Test recordings weren't pressed onto commercial releases. They weren't even supposed to exist outside the studio where they were created. My hands shook as I lifted the needle, the sudden silence more unsettling than the impossible music had been. I flipped the record, checking the label, the catalog number, every printed detail. Everything matched the official release exactly. No variant markings, no indication this was anything other than a standard pressing. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Maybe I was confused about the track listing. Maybe this was a rare variant I'd never encountered. Maybe my obsession with this album had finally driven me to the edge of something I didn't want to examine too closely. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew it didn't belong. Sleep proved impossible that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of the record sitting motionless on my turntable 20 feet away. Twice I got up to check that it was still there, that I hadn't imagined the entire evening. Both times the black vinyl reflected streetlight from my window, solid and undeniably real. The next morning brought no clarity, only deeper questions. I called Resonance Records before they opened, pacing my apartment while their phone rang into voicemail. When they finally answered, the owner's voice carried the weary patience of someone fielding his 100th call about rare pressings. He remembered me, remembered my interest in the album. But when I mentioned the copy I'd somehow acquired, his response froze my blood. Their copy was still in stock, he assured me, still sealed, still priced beyond my reach. He checked it that very morning. I described the burgundy sticker, the catalog number, every detail that proved the record's origin. His confusion deepened with each word, evolving into something that sounded almost like concern. "Sir, I think there might be some mistake. That's the only copy we've had in months. I'm looking at it right now." The conversation ended with promises to investigate, to check their inventory systems, to call me back. But his tone suggested he thought the investigation should probably involve my mental health rather than his record collection. I spent the afternoon researching obsessively, diving deeper into the album's history than I'd ever gone before. Studio logs, session musician credits, alternate takes and unreleased material. Anything that might explain the impossible track I'd heard. The internet offered no answers, only more questions. No mention of additional recordings, no variant pressings, No explanation for what sat on my turntable. As sunset approached, I found myself standing before my stereo system like a penitent before an altar. The record waited, patient and mysterious. Logic demanded I get rid of it, return it to the shop, pretend this had never happened. But collector's instinct runs deeper than logic, and the possibility of owning something truly unique, even if that uniqueness defied explanation, proved stronger than my growing unease. I played the mysterious track again. This time, I paid attention to details beyond the impossible melody. The recording quality matched the rest of the album perfectly. Same room acoustics, same microphone placement, same subtle background noise that marked recordings from that era. Whatever this was, it had been created in the same studio, during the same sessions, by the same musicians. But it didn't exist in any official capacity. The strings swelled and faded exactly as they had the night before, confirming this wasn't some audio hallucination brought on by stress or sleep deprivation. The track was real, present, undeniably part of the record. Yet according to every source I could find, it had never been recorded. Over the following days, my routine began to center around that single track. I played it repeatedly, memorizing every note, every subtle shift in dynamics. The rest of the album ceased to matter. Only those impossible 4 minutes held any significance, drawing me back with an obsession that eclipsed even my original desire to own the record. I started noticing things, small details that shouldn't have been there. During the violin solo, barely audible beneath the main melody, I could hear what sounded like conversation, voices too quiet to understand but distinct enough to confirm their presence. In the final measures, just before the track faded to silence, something that might have been laughter echoed from the speakers. So brief, I could never be sure I'd actually heard it. These details weren't present every time I listened. Sometimes the track played clean, containing only the string arrangement. Other times, these phantom sounds emerged from the mix like secrets reluctantly shared. Their inconsistency made them more unsettling than their presence, suggesting either a recording process far more complex than anything from that era should have been, or something fundamentally wrong with my perception. Sleep became increasingly elusive. When I did manage to drift off, dreams filled with the impossible melody, played by musicians whose faces remained frustratingly obscured. I'd wake with the distinct impression that someone had been in my apartment while I slept. Though nothing was ever disturbed or missing, only the record seemed different somehow, its surface catching light at slightly altered angles, as though it had been moved and replaced with microscopic imprecision. The paranoia grew gradually, so slowly I didn't recognize it until it had established permanent residence in my thoughts. I began checking the locks obsessively, convinced that whoever had left the record might return for reasons I couldn't fathom. The idea that someone was watching me, evaluating my response to their gift, became impossible to shake. Every shadow in peripheral vision might conceal an observer. Every unexpected sound might announce an unwelcome visitor. I called Resonance Records again, needing to hear that their copy was still in stock, still accounted for. The owner's voice carried a note of recognition when he answered, tinged with something that might have been pity. "Still asking about that album?" he said before I could speak. "Still got questions about inventory that doesn't add up." His copy remained where it had always been, he assured me, though now he mentioned details I hadn't asked for. Its exact position on the shelf, the way dust had settled around its edges, proof of its undisturbed presence. These specifics felt like kindness, attempts to anchor my reality to something verifiable. But they only deepened the mystery. If their copy had never moved, where had mine originated? What force had delivered a perfect duplicate to my doorstep, complete with impossible content that shouldn't exist? I started avoiding the record during daylight hours, telling myself I needed perspective, distance from whatever obsession had taken hold. But as evening approached, I invariably found myself drawn back to the turntable, needle poised above the groove that contained my personal impossibility. The track began to change. Not the melody itself, which remained constant, but the emotional weight it carried. What had initially felt beautiful now contained undertones of something darker. The strings still soared, but their flight seemed more desperate than triumphant. The hidden voices grew more frequent, sometimes almost intelligible, whispering words I couldn't quite catch but felt I should understand. Most disturbing was the growing certainty that the track was getting longer. 4 minutes had stretched to nearly 6, though the timing indicator on my stereo insisted otherwise. The additional content wasn't new material, but rather extensions of existing phrases, repetitions that created a hypnotic effect I hadn't noticed before. The music seemed to be adapting itself, growing to accommodate my attention, rewarding my obsession with ever deeper complexity. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each listening session with scientific precision. Time of day, duration of the track, presence or absence of the phantom voices, any variations in the musical arrangement. The data I collected made no logical sense, describing a recording that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. According to my notes, the track sometimes played backward during the violin solo, though the melody remained forward-moving and coherent. On one occasion, I documented hearing piano accompaniment that had never been present before, played in a style that suggested an entirely different musician than the album's credited performer. Another time, the strings were joined by what sounded like electronic synthesizers, technology that hadn't existed when the original album was recorded. Each anomaly felt intentional, as though the record was revealing new layers to someone willing to pay proper attention. But attention to what? And why me? The question haunted me as I sat in the growing darkness of another sleepless night, the impossible track cycling through my mind even when the turntable sat silent. Whatever force had delivered this mystery to my doorstep had chosen me specifically, trusted me with something that defied every rule of reality I thought I understood. The responsibility felt immense, terrifying, and utterly inescapable. Outside my window, the city continued its nightly rhythm, oblivious to the impossibility contained within my walls. Normal people lived normal lives, unburdened by records that shouldn't exist and melodies that changed with each listening. I envied them their certainty, their solid world of explicable cause and effect. But I couldn't return to that world now. The track had marked me, claimed me, made me custodian of something that existed solely in the space between real and impossible. Tomorrow I would play it again, document whatever new impossibility it chose to reveal, and inch closer to an understanding that might destroy everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. The record waited in the darkness, patient as a secret, content to unfold its mysteries one impossible note at a time. And I would listen, because I had no choice. Because some gifts once received transform the recipient so completely that returning to ignorance becomes literally impossible. The phantom pressing had chosen me, and I had chosen it in return, sealing a pact whose terms I was only beginning to understand. In the silence between heartbeats, I could swear I heard those impossible strings still playing, weaving their melody through the fabric of my reality, changing everything they touched into something both beautiful and terrifying. The track would play again tomorrow, and I would be listening, ready or not, when it revealed whatever truth it had been created to share. Story 4. And the first thing you notice about converted industrial buildings is how they breathe differently. The brick walls expand and contract with temperature shifts, creating a symphony of creaks and groans that never quite settles into silence. I'd grown accustomed to these sounds over the 8 months I'd been living in my Minneapolis studio, but when Alex arrived for his 2-week visit, everything changed. It started on his 3rd night. I was washing dishes when every cabinet door in the kitchen swung open simultaneously. Not violently, just a slow, deliberate unfurling like flowers blooming in reverse. The digital clock on the microwave read 5:17 p.m. exactly. Alex was in the shower, the sound of running water masking any noise the hinges might have made, though I noticed there hadn't been any sound at all. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations: old building settling, faulty hinges, some kind of pressure differential. But as I moved from cabinet to cabinet, pressing each door closed with a satisfying click, a cold weight settled in my stomach. Each handle felt warm to the touch, as if someone had been gripping them moments before. The next evening, same time, 5:17 p.m. Every door swung open again. By the 3rd occurrence, I was positioned in the kitchen with my phone, ready to capture the phenomenon. The seconds ticked by. 5:16, 58, 5:16, 59, 5:17, alang. Nothing. I waited 5 more minutes, feeling foolish, then walked toward the living room. Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of wood against wood as 16 cabinet doors opened in perfect unison. Alex emerged from the bathroom as I stood staring at the kitchen, towel wrapped around his waist, hair dripping. "Everything okay?" he asked, noting my expression. I gestured at the open cabinets. "This keeps happening every day at 5:17. He studied the scene with the methodical attention of someone who designs user interfaces for a living, noting patterns, looking for logical explanations. "Could be the heating system. Buildings like this, the HVAC creates pressure changes." He moved to the nearest cabinet, examining the hinges. "These look original, probably just worn out." His rationality should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel more isolated, like I was experiencing something he couldn't see. The photographs started falling 2 days later. I'd hung a series of black and white landscapes along the exposed brick wall, each one carefully leveled and secured. But whenever I walked past the leftmost frame, a shot of the Mississippi River taken from the Stone Arch Bridge, it would slip from its position within minutes, not immediately, never while I was looking. But I'd return to find it hanging crooked or sometimes lying face down on the hardwood floor. I became obsessed with that particular spot. The wall was solid brick, no cracks or irregularities. The hook was firmly anchored. I tried different frames, different hooks, even different photographs. Nothing worked, only that position, and only when I had recently passed by. Alex suggested it might be vibrations from the freight elevator that ran along the same wall. We tested this theory for an entire afternoon, riding the elevator up and down while watching the photographs. They remained perfectly still. That evening, while Alex was on a video call with his team in Portland, I brushed against the wall near the problem spot. The frame didn't just fall, it practically leaped from its hook, landing several feet away with a sharp crack that split the glass diagonally. The water bottle incident happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk responding to emails when the metal cap from Alex's water bottle shot across the room like a champagne cork. It struck the window with such force that I thought the glass might shatter. The bottle itself remained upright on the coffee table, still 3/4 full, showing no sign of pressure buildup or carbonation. Alex looked up from his laptop, startled. "What the hell was that?" I retrieved the cap from where it had rolled under the radiator. The metal was ice cold despite the bottle having sat at room temperature for hours. When I screwed it back on, my fingers tingled with a sensation like mild electrical current. "Maybe the water was contaminated with something," Alex suggested, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Gases building up, creating pressure." We poured the water down the sink and bought new bottles. The phenomenon didn't repeat, but something had shifted. Alex began glancing around the studio with the wary attention of someone who suspects he's being watched. I started researching the building's history during my lunch breaks. The Minneapolis Planning Department had spotty records for industrial conversions, but I eventually traced the property back through a series of ownership transfers. Most entries were routine: business licenses, safety inspections, tax assessments. But buried in the police incident reports from 2003, I found a single entry: disturbance call, noise complaint, neighbor dispute resolved without charges. The address matched my building, Unit 4B, my unit. I called the police records department, hoping for more details, but the clerk explained that incident reports older than 7 years were archived off-site and would require a formal request that could take weeks to process. The notation was too vague to be useful, but something about it gnawed at me. Why would there be a neighbor dispute in a building with such thick walls and widely spaced units? That night, I installed a motion sensor in the hallway. The device was meant for home security, a small wireless unit that could detect movement and send alerts to my phone. I positioned it at the far end of the corridor, aimed toward the main entrance. If someone was coming and going from the building at unusual hours, I'd know about it. The first few nights produced exactly what I expected: occasional notifications when other tenants returned home late or left early for work. But on Friday, the pattern changed. 3:03 a.m. Motion detected. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. The app showed a timestamp and a brief alert. Movement detected in hallway. No additional details, no image capture, just confirmation that something had passed within the sensor's range. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the metal. The hallway was silent except for the building's usual mechanical hum. Through the peephole, I could see the corridor stretching away under harsh fluorescent lighting, empty and undisturbed. The next night, 3:03 a.m. Motion detected, and the night after that, always 3:03 a.m. exactly. Always the same brief alert, followed by silence when I checked the hallway. I began setting an alarm for 3:00 a.m., positioning myself by the door with my ear pressed to the cold metal. But I never heard footsteps, never saw shadows moving past the thin strip of light beneath the door. On the fourth night of 3:03 a.m. alerts, I discovered something else. My smart doorbell was malfunctioning. The device recorded continuously throughout the day, storing footage in a cloud-based system that I could access through an app. But every morning, when I checked the recordings from the previous night, there was a gap. From 3 a.m. to 3:10 a.m., the system showed an error message. Recording interrupted due to network connectivity issues. I contacted the doorbell manufacturer's technical support. After running diagnostics on the device, they confirmed that my internet connection was stable and the hardware was functioning normally. They couldn't explain the recurring network errors, but offered to send a replacement unit. Alex left on a Wednesday morning. I drove him to the airport, making casual conversation about his work projects and his flight connections, but the easy camaraderie we'd shared during the first part of his visit had evaporated. He'd started sleeping with earbuds in, claiming he was listening to meditation apps, but I suspected he was trying to block out sounds that I couldn't hear. "You should probably talk to someone," he said as we stood outside the security checkpoint. "About the stress. This place is getting to you." I wanted to argue, to insist that the phenomena were real and measurable, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain motion sensors that detected nothing, cabinet doors that opened on schedule, or water bottles that launched their caps across the room? How could I describe the growing certainty that something in the building was aware of my presence? Instead, I hugged him goodbye and drove home through streets that seemed unusually empty for midday. That night, alone in the studio, I made a decision. I would stay awake until 3:03 a.m. and position myself in the hallway, waiting to see what triggered the motion sensor. If nothing happened, I'd know the device was malfunctioning. If something did happen, I'd finally have answers. I made coffee and settled into a chair by the door, phone in hand, watching the minutes crawl by. 2:30 a.m., 2:45 a.m., 3:00 a.m. At 3:02, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the doorways of neighboring units. The motion sensor was visible at the far end of the corridor, a small white box mounted near the ceiling. I walked toward it slowly, my bare feet silent on the polished concrete floor. 3:03 a.m. arrived with no fanfare, no motion alert, no mysterious footsteps, no supernatural revelations. Just me, standing alone in an empty hallway, feeling like a fool. I was about to return to my unit when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. The motion sensor was gone. The mounting bracket remained attached to the wall, but the device itself had vanished. I stood on my toes, reaching toward the empty bracket, certain that I was somehow mistaken. But my fingers found only the hollow plastic housing where the sensor should have been. I ran back to my unit and checked my phone. The app still showed the device as connected and active. According to the system, the motion sensor was functioning normally, sending regular heartbeat signals to confirm its operational status. But the physical device was no longer there. I spent the rest of the night pacing the studio, checking and rechecking the app, searching every corner of the hallway for the missing sensor. As dawn broke through the large industrial windows, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that I was losing my mind. But when I checked the doorbell app that morning, I found something that shattered any remaining hope of rational explanation. The usual 3 and 3:10 a.m. network error was gone. Instead, 10 minutes of crystal clear footage showed me walking into the hallway, standing beneath the motion sensor, and reaching toward a mounting bracket that held nothing at all. In the recording, I appeared to be grasping at empty air, my face contorted with confusion and fear. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting, a shadow moved along the wall, a shadow that corresponded to no physical object in the hallway. I watched the footage 17 times, pausing and rewinding, studying every pixel for signs of digital artifacts or compression errors. The shadow was there, undeniably present, moving with purpose and intelligence. It seemed to be watching me as I searched for the missing device, tracking my movements with predatory patience. The last frame before the recording ended showed the shadow extending toward me like a reaching hand. I'm writing this now as the sun sets behind the Minneapolis skyline, painting my studio walls with amber light. It's 5:15 p.m., and I'm sitting in the kitchen, waiting. The cabinet doors will open in 2 minutes, just as they have every day since Alex arrived. The motion sensor app on my phone continues to report normal activity from a device that no longer exists. And tonight, at 3:03 a.m., something will walk these halls while my doorbell records shadows that have no source. I've stopped trying to convince myself that this is stress or imagination or some elaborate psychological breakdown. The evidence is too consistent, too precise, too deliberate. Something in this building knows my routines, responds to my presence, and wants me to understand that I'm not alone. The clock on my microwave reads 5:16. In 60 seconds, 16 cabinet doors will swing open in perfect synchronization, and I'll sit here watching, no longer afraid but somehow comforted by the consistency of the phenomenon. Because the alternative, that my mind has constructed this elaborate pattern of supernatural events to mask some deeper psychological collapse, is far more terrifying than any ghost. The microwave clock ticks to 5:17. Behind me, I hear the soft whisper of wood against wood as every cabinet door opens at once. But this time, for the first time in 2 weeks, I also hear something else. Story 5. The mirror remembers everything. I learned this 3 weeks ago during what our company euphemistically called a team-building retreat in the Colorado Rockies. 28 corporate drones trapped in a converted 19th century lodge, pretending enthusiasm for trust falls and rope climbing while nursing hangovers from the previous night's mandatory bonding session. The kind of place where cell service died the moment you left the main lodge, where the Wi-Fi password was disconnect 2024, and where management consultants with expensive teeth preached about synergy, while eagles circled overhead like corporate vultures. The lodge itself felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Built in 1887 according to the brass plaque by the door, it had been a silver mine headquarters before becoming a tuberculosis sanatorium, then a psychiatric facility, and finally this sanitized retreat center. Too many transitions, too many purposes. The walls seemed to exhale the accumulated weight of all those previous lives, and every floorboard creaked with stories I didn't want to hear. My room was on the 3rd floor, corner unit with a view of the peaks that turned blood red at sunset. The bathroom was original to the building, cast iron fixtures, hexagonal floor tiles worn smooth by decades of feet, and an ornate mirror framed in tarnished silver. Someone had carved a name into the wooden windowsill beside it, Ezekiel Thorne, 1889. The letters were deep and deliberate, as if pressed there with desperate urgency. I might have forgotten about the name entirely, if not for what happened during dinner on the second night. The team-building consultant, a skeletal woman with predatory eyes who insisted we call her Coach Vivian, had been pushing us toward increasingly bizarre exercises. After dinner, while most of the group huddled around the fireplace playing corporate-sanctioned drinking games, she cornered 6 of us in the library. The room smelled of old leather and something else, something organic and patient. Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper as she explained the concept of scrying, the ancient practice of divination through reflective surfaces. Water bowls, crystal balls, mirrors. The firelight played across her face as she described how the old practitioners would stare into polished surfaces until the boundary between self and reflection dissolved, until they could see through the thin places in reality. She claimed the lodge had been built on what the local tribes considered a crossing place, where the veil between worlds wore particularly thin. The previous owners had reported strange phenomena: faces in mirrors that didn't belong to anyone present, voices from empty rooms, cold spots that moved through the hallways like invisible presences. The rational part of my mind recognized this as standard retreat center mysticism, the kind of manufactured spookiness designed to break down professional barriers and force artificial intimacy. But something in her delivery, in the way the shadows seemed to lean closer as she spoke, made my skin crawl with primitive recognition. When she suggested we try our own scrying experiment, using the old bathroom on the 3rd floor, I should have walked away, should have rejoined the safe corporate bonding by the fireplace. Instead, I found myself volunteering, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The rules were simple: complete darkness except for a single candle placed behind your left shoulder, a basin of water positioned to reflect both your face and the mirror, and most importantly, you had to repeat the name carved in the windowsill. Ezekiel Thorne. 5 minutes of unbroken concentration, staring into your own reflected eyes. Coach Vivian led us up to the bathroom, her flashlight beam dancing across the narrow hallway. The space felt smaller at night, more confined. She positioned the brass basin on the sink counter, filled it with water from the tap, and lit a thick pillar candle. The flame cast everything in trembling amber, transforming familiar fixtures into something ancient and expectant. The others took their turns first. 2 backed out within minutes, claiming they felt dizzy or nauseous. 1 insisted she saw another woman's face superimposed over her own, but when pressed for details, she became vague and defensive. The 4th participant emerged after the full 5 minutes, shaking but claiming nothing had happened. Then it was my turn. The bathroom door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden darkness. The candle flame behind my left shoulder cast a warm circle of light, but beyond that circle, the shadows pressed close like living things. I positioned myself in front of the mirror, hands gripping the edge of the sink, and stared into my own reflected eyes. For the first minute, nothing happened. Just my familiar face staring back, tired brown eyes, 2 days of stubble, the slight asymmetry of features I'd grown up with. I began repeating the name as instructed, letting the syllables roll through my mind like a mantra. Ezekiel Thorne. Ezekiel Thorne. The water in the basin reflected both my face and the mirror behind me, creating a doubled image that hurt to focus on. I found myself drawn to the reflection in the water rather than the glass, watching the way the candlelight rippled across the surface with each slight movement of air. Somewhere around the 2-minute mark, I noticed the first change. My reflection seemed to lag slightly, like a video call with poor connection. I would blink, and a split second later, my reflected self would follow. I would turn my head minutely to the left, and the reflection would catch up a heartbeat behind. The effect was subtle enough that I might have dismissed it as fatigue or eye strain, but it grew more pronounced with each repetition of the name. Ezekiel Thorne. Ezekiel Thorne. By the 3rd minute, the lag had become undeniable. My reflection moved independently, blinking when I wasn't blinking, turning to examine angles of the bathroom I couldn't see. When I raised my hand to touch my cheek, the reflection raised its hand to touch the glass instead, palm pressed flat against the surface from the inside. That's when I should have stopped. Should have backed away from the mirror and called for Coach Vivian. But the name continued to spill from my lips like an involuntary prayer, and something in my reflection's eyes held me frozen. They were still my eyes, but they looked at me with an expression I'd never worn. Desperate, pleading, terrified. The 4th minute brought complete divergence. My reflection's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help me. The lips shaped the syllables with increasing urgency. Please, help me. Behind my reflected self, the bathroom grew larger, stretching back into shadows that shouldn't exist. The hexagonal tiles became a checkerboard pattern. The fixtures aged and corroded. Candles appeared along the walls, their flames guttering in a wind I couldn't feel. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, my face wasn't my face anymore. The man looking back at me was pale as winter moonlight, with deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds and a nose that had been broken more than once. He wore a high-starched collar from another century, and his dark hair was slicked back with what might have been pomade, or might have been something less pleasant. When he smiled, his teeth were too sharp, too numerous, like a mouthful of needles. I tried to step back, but my feet seemed rooted to the hexagonal tiles. The name continued to pour from my lips. Ezekiel Thorne, Ezekiel Thorne. And with each repetition, the stranger's smile grew wider. His hands, pale and long-fingered, pressed against the glass from the inside, and I could see the condensation of his breath fogging the surface. The temperature in the bathroom plummeted. My exhaled breath became visible clouds, and frost began forming on the edges of the mirror, but the candle flame behind me never wavered, never dimmed, casting everything in that same warm amber glow that now felt like the light from a funeral pyre. The stranger, Ezekiel Thorne, I realized with sick certainty, pressed his face closer to the glass. His lips moved again, and this time I heard the words, thin and distant as if traveling through water. "Let me out." That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, my hip catching the edge of the basin and sending it crashing to the floor. Water splashed across the tiles and my legs, shockingly cold. The candle guttered but didn't die, its flame dancing wildly in the sudden disturbance. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking so violently I could barely make contact. When the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, the bathroom returned to its normal proportions. The mirror showed only my own face, pale, terrified, but undeniably mine. The tiles were hexagonal again, the fixtures merely old but not ancient, but pressed against the inside surface of the glass at exactly the height where my chin had been, were 5 perfect circle marks, fingerprints, as if someone had pressed their hand against the mirror from within, desperate to push through to this side. I fled the bathroom, leaving the candle burning and the basin overturned. In the hallway, Coach Vivian waited with the others, her expression expectant. When she asked what I'd seen, I told her nothing, just dizzy spells and imagination. The standard disclaimer of a man trying to convince himself that what he'd experienced wasn't real. But that was 3 weeks ago, and the marks are still there. I know because I've checked every day since returning home. Not physical marks. Those cleaned away easily enough with glass cleaner and paper towels. These marks are different, visible only at certain angles, in certain light. Like the ghost of pressure, the echo of desperate contact. And lately I've been seeing him in other mirrors, not clearly, not obviously. Just glimpses at the edge of vision, the suggestion of a pale face in bathroom mirrors, the hint of a starched collar in storefront reflections. Always when I'm alone, always when the light hits just right. He appears for a fraction of a second and then vanishes, leaving me questioning whether I saw anything at all. My rational mind insists this is psychological. Suggestion and stress combining to create false pattern recognition, the human brain's tendency to see faces in random stimuli. I've researched scrying, read about its history and effects. Prolonged staring at reflective surfaces can trigger mild hallucinations, temporary dissociation, false memories. The brain, deprived of normal input patterns, begins creating its own narrative. But if that's true, why do the fingerprints keep appearing? I've tested every mirror in my apartment, watching for the telltale signs of that impossible pressure from within. Most remain clear, reflecting only what they should. But occasionally, usually late at night, when exhaustion makes the boundary between waking and dreaming permeable, they appear. 5 circular impressions at chin height, as if someone were pushing against the glass from inside the mirror itself. I've started avoiding mirrors when possible. I shave by feel, brush my teeth looking down at the sink, avert my eyes from storefront windows when walking downtown. But complete avoidance is impossible in modern life, and each accidental glimpse brings a moment of paralyzing fear. Is today the day he pushes through? Is today the day the glass finally yields to that desperate century-old pressure? The worst part is the growing certainty that Ezekiel Thorne was real. My research into the lodge's history confirmed his existence. A silver mine foreman who disappeared in 1889, last seen entering the building that would become the retreat center. His body was never found, but several witnesses reported seeing him in mirrors throughout the facility for weeks after his disappearance. The accounts were dismissed as hysteria and grief-induced hallucination, but they match my experience too closely to ignore. The lodge records, what few survived various ownership changes, mention other incidents over the decades. Guests reporting strange reflections, mirrors cracking for no apparent reason, the sound of hands slapping against glass from inside empty rooms. Each incident was carefully documented and then forgotten, filed away like an embarrassing family secret. I think about returning to the lodge, confronting whatever presence I awakened during that scrying session. But I'm terrified of what I might find there, what I might confirm about the nature of reality and the thickness of the barriers we trust to separate the living from whatever comes after. Instead, I watch my mirrors and wait, count the fingerprints and measure their clarity, document the frequency of his appearances, looking for patterns that might explain why some days he's stronger than others. Because he is getting stronger. The glimpses last longer now, linger at the edges of reflection until I'm forced to acknowledge them. His face is becoming clearer, more detailed. Sometimes I catch him looking not at me, but around me, examining the room behind my shoulder with the hungry curiosity of someone who has been trapped for a very long time. And last night, for the first time, I heard him speak. I was brushing my teeth, eyes carefully focused on the sink, when his voice drifted from the mirror like smoke. The barrier grows thin. Soon. I looked up before I could stop myself, met his storm cloud eyes in the reflection. He smiled that needle-toothed smile and pressed both hands against the glass. This time, the fingerprints didn't fade when he vanished. They remained, 10 perfect circles of impossible pressure, as real and permanent as my own reflection. The mirror remembers everything, and Ezekiel Thorne has been very patient. But I think his patience is finally running out. Tonight, I'm going to cover every mirror in my apartment. Tomorrow, I'm going to find a priest, a medium, someone who deals with things that shouldn't exist but do anyway. Because whatever boundary I cross during that scrying session is breaking down, and I can feel him pressing against it from the other side with increasing desperation. The marks are spreading to other surfaces now. Windows, computer screens, anything that can cast a reflection. And each morning, they're a little deeper, a little more permanent. I'm beginning to understand that the question isn't whether Ezekiel Thorne is real. The question is whether I'm real enough to resist when he finally breaks through. The mirror remembers everything, and it's starting to forget the difference between what belongs on this side of the glass and what doesn't. Story 6. The electric keyboard arrived on a Tuesday, second-hand but pristine, its black and white keys gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the music store. I'd been saving for months, working double shifts at the warehouse just to afford this modest Yamaha model. Nothing fancy, but enough to explore the harmonic progressions that had been consuming my thoughts lately. The salesman assured me it had belonged to a music teacher, someone who'd taken exceptional care of it. That first night, I set it up in my bedroom, connecting the headphones so I wouldn't disturb the neighbors in my thin-walled apartment. The digital display glowed a soft green in the darkness, numbers and letters that made sense in daylight, but seemed somehow ominous at 2 a.m. I'd always been a night owl, and the late hours were when my mind felt most receptive to music theory, when the complex relationships between notes and intervals seemed to reveal themselves. I started with simple major chords, feeling the familiar weight of the keys beneath my fingers. C major, F major, G major, the building blocks of countless songs. But what drew me deeper were the augmented chords, those unstable combinations that created tension, demanding resolution. There was something about their dissonance that spoke to the restlessness I'd been feeling lately, the sense that something in my life was slightly off-kilter, waiting to be corrected. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as imagination. I was working through a sequence of augmented sevenths, lost in the mathematical beauty of their construction, when I noticed a faint light pulsing in my peripheral vision. The metronome app on my phone, which I'd paused 20 minutes earlier, was blinking. Not the usual steady flash of an active tempo, but a slow, deliberate pulse, 72 beats per minute, according to the display. I stopped playing and stared at the phone. The app showed it was paused, yet the light continued its rhythm. When I touched the screen to restart and stop it again, the pulsing ceased immediately. Probably a software glitch, I told myself. These music apps were notorious for bugs. But the next night brought something stranger. As I delved into the same augmented progressions, not only did the metronome light begin its ghostly blinking, but I felt something else. A subtle vibration through the mattress, as if someone beneath my apartment was tapping their heel against the floor in time with that phantom 72 BPM pulse. The building was old, with thin floors and walls that transmitted every sound from the units above and below. Yet when I stopped playing and listened carefully, the vibration ceased, leaving only the ambient hum of the refrigerator and the distant whisper of traffic. Sleep came reluctantly those nights. I'd lie in bed, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the building's structure. Sometimes I thought I heard the faint echo of piano notes from somewhere in the building, but when I pressed my ear to the wall or floor, there was only silence. By the third week, I'd developed a ritual. I would set up my recording equipment, a cheap USB microphone I'd bought online, before each practice session. If something unusual was happening, I wanted documentation. The first few recordings were clean, capturing only my hesitant exploration of jazz harmonies and classical progressions. But when I began those specific augmented sequences, the recordings revealed something that made my skin crawl. There, buried in the background static, was a ninth note. Not from my playing, I was careful to press only the keys I intended, but a clear, distinct tone that completed each triad I'd begun. When I played CEGRO, the recording captured an additional B-flat, turning my simple augmented chord into a complex ninth. When I moved to FACAU, a phantom E-flat joined the harmony. Each time, the ghost note was precisely placed, musically correct, as if someone with intimate knowledge of harmony was completing my thoughts. I spent hours analyzing the audio files, zooming in on waveforms, adjusting EQ settings to isolate the phantom frequencies. The notes were there, undeniably present in the digital data, yet they came from no identifiable source. The microphone was positioned to capture only my keyboard's output, and I'd checked every setting, every connection. The additional tones seemed to materialize from the ambient noise of the room itself. The logical explanations felt increasingly hollow. Electronic interference from nearby devices, they said on the music forums where I'd posted anonymously. Harmonic overtones creating phantom fundamentals. Psychological suggestion making me hear patterns that weren't there. But the recordings didn't lie, and the mathematical precision of those completing notes suggested an intelligence behind them. Someone or something that understood music theory better than I did. I began leaving the keyboard case closed when I wasn't playing, a superstitious gesture that made me feel slightly more in control. But each evening when I returned from work, exhausted from loading trucks and sorting packages, I'd find the Yamaha in split mode, a setting that divided the keyboard into two different voices, allowing for piano on the lower keys and strings on the upper register. I never used split mode. The preset was always the same, a rich cathedral-like organ sound on the lower section, something that reminded me of funeral masses and midnight vigils. The first time, I assumed I'd bumped the control panel while closing the case. But as it continued happening, night after night, I began paying closer attention to every detail. I started leaving the power completely off, unplugging the unit from the wall. Still, when I returned home and powered it on, the split setting was active, the organ voice loaded and waiting. I mentioned it casually to my downstairs neighbor, an elderly man named Leo, who'd lived in the building for 30 years. He listened with the patience of someone accustomed to tenants' complaints about noise and odd occurrences. When I described the metronome issue and the vibrations through the floor, something shifted in his expression. "The unit above yours," he said slowly. "It's been empty for 2 months. Previous tenant moved out suddenly, left most of his stuff behind. Management's been showing it to prospective renters, but..." He paused, studying my face. Strange you'd mention vibrations through the floor. Previous guy was a musician too. Played piano at all hours. Management got complaints. But when they'd send someone to check, they'd find him sound asleep, swearing he hadn't touched the instrument all evening. The information settled in my stomach like a cold stone. An empty apartment above mine. Yet the vibrations continued. A musician who'd left suddenly, abandoning his possessions. I wanted to ask Leo more questions, but the conversation felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to traverse. That night, I positioned myself differently during practice. Instead of sitting with my back to the room, I angled the bench so I could see the bedroom door and the darkened hallway beyond. The green glow of the keyboard's display provided enough light to make out shapes and shadows, but not enough to distinguish details. I began the augmented progression slowly, methodically. CEGI held for 4 beats. The metronome app pulsed its ghostly rhythm, and right on schedule, the bed frame transmitted that heel-tap vibration from above. But tonight, I was watching, and as I moved to the second chord, FACI, I saw movement in the doorway. A shadow shifted, just barely perceptible in my peripheral vision. When I turned my head directly toward it, there was nothing. Just the familiar outline of the hallway and the closed bathroom door beyond. But the sense of being observed was overwhelming, the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every movement. I forced myself to continue playing, even as every instinct screamed at me to stop, to pack up the keyboard and never touch it again. The phantom ninth notes were stronger now in the headphones, more distinct, as if whatever was producing them had grown more confident. The completing harmonies came faster, anticipating my chord changes by fractions of a second. When I finally stopped playing and pulled off the headphones, the silence was deafening. No more metronome pulse, no more vibrations, no more shadow in the doorway. Just the ordinary sounds of a city night filtering through thin walls and windows. But the air in the room felt different, charged with a presence that hadn't been there an hour earlier. I began avoiding the augmented progressions, sticking to safer territory, major scales, simple folk melodies, anything that didn't seem to trigger the strange phenomena. For 3 nights, the practice sessions were peaceful. No phantom metronome, no mysterious ninth notes, no split mode settings when I returned from work. I started to convince myself that the whole experience had been stress-related, a product of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But avoidance felt like cowardice, and music had always been about pushing boundaries, exploring the uncomfortable spaces between conventional harmonies. On Saturday night, with the weekend stretching ahead and no work obligations to distract me, I made a decision. I set up the recording equipment with meticulous care, checking every connection twice. I positioned 2 microphones at different angles, hoping to triangulate the source of the phantom notes. I even borrowed a small video camera from a friend, setting it up to record both the keyboard and the doorway simultaneously. The augmented progressions flowed from my fingers with increasing complexity. I moved beyond simple triads to sevenths, ninths, and even more exotic combinations. The accompanying phenomena began almost immediately. The metronome pulse, the vibrations, the sense of a presence gathering strength in the room. But tonight, I pushed further, playing louder and with more aggressive rhythms. The completing notes in my headphones grew bolder, no longer content to fill in simple harmonies. Entire melodic lines began weaving through my playing, counterpoint melodies that demonstrated a sophistication I couldn't match. When I played staccato, the phantom notes were legato. When I played in the lower register, the additions came from the highest treble ranges. It was as if someone were engaged in a musical conversation with me, responding to my phrases with increasingly complex variations. The shadow in the doorway became more distinct, no longer fleeting, but persistent. Through the corner of my eye, I could make out what appeared to be a seated figure, hunched over what might have been another keyboard. When I tried to look directly, the image would dissolve, but the moment I returned my attention to my own playing, the shadow would reconstitute itself. I played for 2 hours straight, driven by a mixture of fascination and terror. The music that emerged from this supernatural collaboration was unlike anything I'd ever created. Complex, emotionally rich, technically challenging. Part of me wanted to continue indefinitely, to see how far this phantom partnership could evolve. But the rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. This was beyond normal experience, beyond comfortable explanation. Whatever was happening in this room, whatever presence was responding to my music, it was growing stronger with each session. The empty apartment above, the previous tenant's sudden departure, the precision of the musical responses, pieces of a puzzle that I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. When I finally stopped playing, the silence was absolute. No gradual fade of the phantom notes, no lingering vibrations. Just an immediate and complete cessation that felt almost like a held breath. I sat motionless for several minutes, afraid that any movement might restart the phenomenon. The video camera had recorded everything. The audio files were captured on multiple devices, and somewhere in that digital data was proof of what I'd experienced. But as I reached for the equipment, a thought stopped me cold. What if the evidence was there? What if the recordings clearly showed something that shouldn't exist, captured sounds that had no source, documented the undocumented? Did I really want to know? Did I want to confirm that the laws of physics and reality were more flexible than I'd assumed? Or would it be better to delete the files, pack up the keyboard, and retreat to a world where mysterious phenomena were safely confined to fiction? The decision felt monumentally important, as if choosing to examine the evidence would commit me to a path I couldn't later abandon. The keyboard sat silent in the green glow of its display, the split mode setting already active for tomorrow's session, waiting with infinite patience for my return. Above me, in the supposedly empty apartment, I could swear I heard the faint creak of floorboards as someone, or something, finally rose from their own bench and walked away from their own instrument, leaving me alone with questions I wasn't sure I had the courage to answer. I reached for the camera's power button, my finger hovering over the switch that would show me what the lens had captured. In that moment of hesitation, I realized that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The music had brought me to this threshold, and the next note I played, whether literal or metaphorical, would determine which side of reality I would inhabit from now on. The apartment remained silent, but the silence itself had become an instrument, playing harmonies I was only beginning to understand. Story 7. The bell tower knew my schedule better than I did. Every morning at 5:30, my running shoes would crunch against the frost-covered gravel path that wound through the campus of Whitmore College. Vermont autumns painted the world in shades of dying fire, and the ancient brick buildings seemed to huddle closer together as if seeking warmth from each other's shadows. But it was the tower that drew my attention, that skeletal finger of weathered stone pointing accusingly at the gray dawn sky. The thing had been silent for decades, its bells long since removed, its purpose reduced to housing a clock that the groundskeepers forgot to wind half the time. Yet every morning, as I rounded the bend near the philosophy building, I'd catch sight of movement behind those uppermost shutters. A figure, always motionless, always positioned as if about to reach for ropes that no longer existed. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the way shadows could play games with tired eyes. After all, what kind of person would stand in a drafty tower at dawn, perfectly still, watching the world wake up? The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned me a graduate degree in mechanical engineering, dismissed it as visual noise, pattern recognition gone haywire. But the figure never moved, never shifted weight, never turned away. The morning everything changed started like any other. October had settled into its final weeks, bringing with it that peculiar quality of light that made everything appear slightly out of focus, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My breath came in visible puffs as I jogged past the dormitories, their windows dark except for the occasional blue glow of a laptop screen. The tower loomed ahead, its clock face reading 5:47, 12 minutes fast, as usual. The groundskeepers had given up trying to synchronize it with anything resembling actual time. But there, behind the shutters, stood the familiar silhouette. Waiting. Always waiting. Something about the sight that morning struck me as particularly absurd. Here I was, A grown man getting spooked by shadows and architectural quirks. The academic stress was probably getting to me. Dissertation deadlines, teaching responsibilities, the constant pressure to publish or perish. Dr. Hennings had been writing the entire department lately about productivity metrics. So I stopped running. The gravel crunched under my feet as I came to a halt directly in front of the tower. The figure remained motionless behind those weathered shutters, a dark shape against the marginally lighter darkness within. For a moment I considered calling out, maybe asking if whoever was up there needed help. But that seemed ridiculous. What if it really was just a shadow? What if I was talking to empty air? Instead, I raised my hands and clapped. 3 sharp, deliberate claps that echoed off the surrounding buildings like gunshots in the pre-dawn stillness. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. And then, with a mechanical grinding that made my teeth ache, the clock hands began to move. Not forward, as they should have with the passage of time, but backward. Slowly, deliberately, they retreated 2 full minutes. 5:45, I stared at the clock face, certain I was imagining things. Clocks didn't run backward, not without significant mechanical intervention anyway. But even as I watched, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, something pale fluttered down from the shutters above. A piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, landed at my feet with the gentleness of a falling leaf. I picked it up with trembling fingers. Sheet music, handwritten in faded ink, the notes dancing across staff lines like insects trapped in amber. At the top, in elegant script that belonged to a different century, someone had written, "The Vigil of Hours, Movement We." The paper felt old between my fingers, far older than something that had just appeared from within the tower. The ink had that particular brown quality that came from decades of age, and the paper itself had the texture of parchment. But I had seen it flutter down, had watched it emerge from between those shutters as if pushed from within. I looked up, but the figure was gone. The rest of my run passed in a blur of mechanical motion and churning thoughts. My feet carried me through the familiar circuit, past the library with its Gothic arches, around the student center where early cafeteria workers were beginning to arrive, back toward my apartment in the graduate housing complex. But my mind remained fixed on the tower, on the impossible backward movement of those clock hands, on the aged manuscript now folded carefully in my jacket pocket. By the time I showered and dressed for my morning classes, I had almost convinced myself it had been some kind of elaborate prank. College campuses were breeding grounds for creative mischief, and engineering students in particular took pride in their technical pranks. Someone had probably rigged the clock mechanism with a remote control, dropped the paper from a window at just the right moment. The figure behind the shutters could have been a mannequin, a scarecrow, anything designed to create an unsettling focal point. But the explanation felt hollow, forced. It didn't account for the age of the paper, for the precision of the timing, for the way the figure had simply vanished between one glance and the next. The sheet music remained in my jacket pocket throughout the day, a constant weight against my ribs. During my thermodynamics lecture, I found myself reaching for it, touching the folded edge through the fabric. My students must have noticed my distraction. I caught several confused looks when I lost my train of thought mid-equation. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and spread the manuscript flat under my desk lamp. The notation was complex, unlike anything I recognized from my limited musical background. The time signature seemed to shift throughout the piece, and some of the symbols appeared to be hand-drawn variations on standard notation. At the bottom of the page, in the same elegant script, someone had added a note: "To be performed at the turning of hours, when the watchers gather." I photographed the document and ran the image through several online databases, searching for similar compositions or handwriting samples. The closest match I found was a collection of 18th century liturgical music housed at a monastery in Switzerland, but even that was a stretch. The notation style seemed to predate modern musical standardization by decades, possibly centuries. The rational explanation was that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create an authentic-looking forgery. But why? And how had they managed the clock mechanism? I had examined the tower's exterior that afternoon during my lunch break, looking for any sign of recent mechanical modifications or remote control devices. The stone showed no evidence of tampering, and the shutters themselves appeared to be original, their hinges corroded with decades of weather exposure. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark silhouette behind those shutters, patient and eternal. The image had burned itself into my retinas like a photographic negative, refusing to fade even when I tried to focus on other thoughts. The next morning, I deliberately chose a different route for my run. Instead of following the gravel path past the tower, I circled around through the athletic complex and approached the main campus from the opposite direction. But as I rounded the corner near the science building, the tower came into view, and there was the figure, positioned exactly as before. Only this time it was facing the other direction. If it had been the same shadow, the same play of light and architecture that I had been seeing, it should have appeared identical regardless of my viewing angle. But the silhouette was clearly oriented toward the path I usually took, as if it had adjusted its position to maintain visual contact with my regular route, which meant either I was losing my grip on reality or something was actually up there, tracking my movements. I completed the rest of my run on autopilot, my mind wrestling with the implications. When I returned to my apartment, I pulled up the college's online archives and began searching for any historical information about the bell tower. What I found made my stomach clench with unease. The tower had been built in 1847 as part of the original campus expansion. For nearly 60 years it had functioned normally, its bells marking the hours for students and faculty. But in 1905, the college had abruptly discontinued its use following what the archive described as an unfortunate incident involving the night watchman. The details were frustratingly vague. According to a brief newspaper account from the local paper, the watchman had been found in the tower one morning, alive, but in a state of complete catatonia. He had apparently spent the entire night pulling the bell ropes in a complex pattern that bore no resemblance to normal timekeeping. When questioned about his actions, he could only repeat fragments of what sounded like musical notation: D sharp, rest, A flat, diminuendo. The man had been committed to the state asylum, where he continued his obsessive recitation of musical phrases until his death 3 years later. The college, perhaps understandably, had decided that hiring another night watchman was not worth the risk. But here was the detail that made my hands shake as I read. The newspaper account mentioned that the watchman had been found with numerous sheets of hand-notated musical compositions, apparently of his own creation, each bearing the title, "The Vigil of Hours," followed by various movement numbers. I pulled the manuscript from my jacket pocket and smoothed it on the desk beside my laptop screen. "The Vigil of Hours, Movement I." The handwriting was identical to the samples reproduced in the newspaper's grainy photographs. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mechanically completed tasks. I taught my scheduled classes, attended a department meeting, graded midterm exams. But underneath the routine surface of academic life, my thoughts churned like water approaching a drain. Every logical explanation I constructed crumbled under the weight of accumulated impossibilities. That evening, I stood at my apartment window and stared across the campus toward the tower. Even from this distance, I could make out the dark shape behind the shutters, perfectly motionless in the gathering dusk. As I watched, the clock struck 8, or at least, that's what time my watch showed. But the clock face on the tower read 8:03. 3 minutes fast now, instead of the usual 12. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. If I was losing my mind, I needed to know. And if I wasn't, well, that possibility was somehow even more terrifying. The campus after dark took on a different character entirely. The familiar paths became uncertain territory, lit by pools of yellow light from scattered lampposts that seemed to create more shadows than they banished. My footsteps echoed off the surrounding buildings as I made my way toward the tower, each sound seeming to announce my approach to whatever waited in the darkness above. The main door to the tower was supposed to be locked, had been locked for decades according to the maintenance records I'd managed to access. But when I tried the handle, it turned with the smooth ease of recent use. The hinges swung open without a sound, revealing a narrow stone staircase that spiraled upward into blackness. I had brought a flashlight, but I found I didn't need it. A pale, silvery light filtered down from somewhere above, illuminating the worn stone steps and the iron railing that had been polished smooth by countless hands. The air inside smelled of dust and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. Each step carried me further from the rational world I understood. The staircase seemed to climb for much longer than the tower's external height would suggest, winding upward in a tight spiral that made me dizzy. At regular intervals, narrow window slits provided glimpses of the campus below, each view appearing slightly different from what I remembered, as if the angle of observation was subtly wrong. Finally, I reached a small landing with a wooden door set into the stone wall. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see the mechanism of the clock. Massive gears and pendulums that should have been silent, but were instead moving with purpose and precision. The sound they made was not the rhythmic ticking I expected, but something more complex, almost musical. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The clockwork filled most of the circular room, its brass components gleaming in that strange, sourceless light. But it was not the mechanical marvel that captured my attention. It was the figure standing beside the largest gear assembly. A man in a dark coat that belonged to another century, his back turned toward me as he made minute adjustments to the mechanism with tools that seemed to extend directly from his fingers. He did not turn around when I entered, but he spoke in a voice like wind through autumn leaves. "You're early tonight. The 7th movement isn't scheduled until tomorrow's dawn." I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, who he was, what he meant. But no sound emerged from my throat. The room seemed to press in around me, filled with the complex rhythms of the clockwork and something else, a melody that seemed to play just at the edge of hearing. "Time is a river," the figure continued, still working at his impossible adjustments. "But rivers can be dammed, diverted, made to flow backward when the need arises. The college hired me to keep the hours, and keep them I shall. Every minute, every second catalogued and preserved." He finally turned, and I saw that his face was my own. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical in every detail, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But his eyes held decades of weariness, of watching and waiting and measuring time in units I couldn't comprehend. "You've been very punctual in your morning runs," he said with my voice. "Consistency is important to the work, but you're developing an unfortunate tendency to vary your route." I tried to step backward, to retreat down the stairs, but my legs wouldn't obey. The melodic undertone grew stronger, resolving into something that matched the notation on the manuscript in my pocket. A complex, shifting harmony that seemed to rewrite itself with each note. "The vigil requires precision," my other self explained, producing a sheet of music identical to the one I carried. "Each movement corresponds to a specific temporal adjustment. The college must be kept in its proper relationship to the broader flow of hours. Sometimes that means moving backward, sometimes forward. The mathematics are quite elegant, really." The clockwork around us began to shift its rhythm, gears engaging and disengaging in patterns that hurt to observe directly. The sound it made was no longer mechanical, but purely musical. The same complex notation that I now realized had been playing in my head since that first morning when I had seen the figure behind the shutters. "You understand now?" he said, and I did. The figure I had been seeing wasn't watching the campus. It was adjusting reality itself, keeping the college locked in a temporal bubble that existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. Every morning run had been bringing me closer to this moment, this room, this impossible convergence. "The previous watchman lasted 37 years before the strain became too much," my other self continued. "I've managed 42 so far, but I can feel the threads beginning to fray. Time has weight, you see. It accumulates. Eventually, every watchman reaches the point where the burden must be shared." He extended his hand, and in it was another sheet of music. Movement the 8 of the vigil of hours. The notation seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at it, transforming from musical notes into something that resembled mathematical equations, then back again. "The transition is quite simple," he assured me. "You merely take your position behind the shutters and begin the morning adjustments. The college has been expecting you. They've prepared your schedule, arranged for your morning runs to coincide with the optimal observation points. Dr. Hennings is particularly pleased with your punctuality. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Every aspect of my graduate program, every seemingly random assignment of my apartment location, every detail that had brought me to this campus had been orchestrated to deliver me to this moment. I thought about the archive records I had accessed so easily, the newspaper articles that had appeared in search results with suspicious convenience. The music will teach you everything you need to know, my other self continued. Each movement contains the mathematical relationships necessary for temporal adjustment. Play them in sequence, and the hours obey. Miss a note, and... He gestured vaguely toward the window. Well, you've seen what happens to those who can't maintain the proper rhythms. I finally found my voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. What if I refuse? His smile was sad and infinitely patient. Then you'll wake up tomorrow morning at 5:30, and you'll start your run, and you'll pass by the tower just as you always have, and you'll see me behind the shutters, waiting. And eventually, the music will call to you again, stronger each time, until you return here of your own accord. The vigil has its own gravity, you see. Once you've glimpsed the mechanism, you become part of it. As if to demonstrate his point, the clockwork around us began another of its impossible transitions, and I felt something shift in my chest, a rhythm that matched the mechanical symphony surrounding us. My heartbeat, my breathing, even the electrical patterns in my brain were synchronizing with the temporal adjustments happening in real time. How long do I have? I asked. Before you take over completely? Years, perhaps decades. The transition is gradual. We share the burden until one of us can no longer maintain the necessary focus. But you'll begin to understand tomorrow morning when you pass the tower. You'll see me, but you'll also feel the music beginning to play in your thoughts. It starts gently, just a melody that matches your running pace. Eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. I looked around the clockwork chamber, trying to memorize every detail, every impossible gear and pendulum. When I left this room, if I left this room, would I remember any of this? Or would it fade like a dream, leaving only a nagging sense of unease and the growing compulsion to maintain my morning routine? The faculty meeting tomorrow will include a discussion of your research schedule, my other self mentioned casually. Dr. Hennings will suggest some adjustments to your coursework, fewer evening seminars, more morning responsibilities. You'll find the suggestions quite reasonable. The music was growing louder now, or perhaps I was becoming more sensitive to it. I could identify individual movements within the overall composition, themes that corresponded to different aspects of temporal manipulation. The mathematics underlying it all was surprisingly elegant, a perfect fusion of music theory and quantum mechanics that should have been impossible but felt as natural as breathing. I should return to my post, my other self said, moving toward a narrow ladder that led to the shutter level above. The dawn adjustment requires preparation, and you'll be passing by in approximately 7 hours. Wouldn't want to disappoint. As he climbed, I called after him. What happens if the college doesn't need a watchman anymore? If they tear down the tower, or convert it to something else? He paused, looking down at me with an expression of gentle amusement. The college will always need a watchman. Time doesn't maintain itself, after all. And the tower, well, the tower exists in more than just physical space now. It's become part of the temporal architecture. Even if they demolished every stone, the mechanism would continue. I descended the staircase in silence, my mind struggling to process what I had experienced. The rational part of my brain insisted that I had suffered some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation had finally pushed me into a complete break from reality. But the sheet music in my pocket felt real enough, and when I emerged from the tower, the clock face read exactly 5 minutes past midnight, which was precisely what my watch showed. For the first time in weeks, the tower's clock was perfectly synchronized. I spent the remainder of the night sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the 2 pieces of sheet music I now possessed, Movement I and Movement 8 of the Vigil of Hours, bookends of a composition that spanned decades and defied every natural law I understood. As dawn approached, I found myself humming the melody from Movement 1, though I had no memory of learning it. At 5:30, my alarm rang as usual, and despite every rational impulse screaming at me to stay in bed, to break the pattern, to choose a different path, I found myself lacing up my running shoes. The gravel crunched under my feet with familiar precision as I made my way toward the tower. The sky was lightening in the east, painting the campus in shades of gray and gold that seemed somehow more vivid than usual. Each step carried me closer to the inevitable moment when I would round the bend and see the tower, see the figure behind the shutters. But this time, I knew I would also feel the music beginning to play in my thoughts, a gentle melody that matched my running pace, growing stronger with each passing day until it became impossible to ignore. The vigil had its own gravity, my other self had said, and as I approached the tower, I could already feel it pulling at me, drawing me into its temporal embrace. The figure behind the shutters raised one hand in greeting as I passed, and despite myself, despite every instinct for self-preservation, I raised my hand in return. The music was beautiful, really, complex and mathematical and perfectly, impossibly precise. I wondered how long it would be before I could play it myself. Story 8. The fluorescent light above the bathroom mirror flickered with that familiar airport hotel rhythm, 3 steady pulses, then darkness for a heartbeat before resuming its sterile glow. I'd grown accustomed to these mechanical imperfections during my countless layovers, but tonight, something felt different about this particular room on the 7th floor of the Charlotte Airport Marriott. Perhaps it was the way the heating unit beneath the window seemed to whisper rather than hum, or how the digital clock's red numerals appeared slightly blurred at the edges, as if viewed through water. I'd arrived on the delayed 11:47 from Denver, my connecting flight to Tampa rescheduled for morning due to weather down the coast. The front desk clerk had been apologetic but efficient, her practiced smile never wavering as she explained the shuttle schedule and breakfast hours. Room 714 was identical to hundreds of others I'd occupied over the years. Beige walls adorned with mass-produced artwork depicting Charlotte's skyline, a desk positioned beneath a window overlooking the parking garage, and that particular smell of industrial carpet cleaner mixed with recycled air that defined these temporary spaces. The bed dominated the room with its crisp white linens and decorative pillows arranged with mathematical precision. I'd always admired the housekeeping staff's attention to detail, the way they could transform a space that had hosted countless strangers into something that felt momentarily personal. The corners were tucked with military precision, the top sheet folded back at exactly the right angle to reveal the hotel's logo embroidered on the pillowcase. After unpacking my carry-on and setting my phone to charge on the nightstand, I settled into the room's routine. The shower water ran tepid, despite the handle being turned to its hottest setting, and the towels carried that particular stiffness of commercial laundry. I brushed my teeth while studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting how the overhead lighting cast shadows beneath my eyes that seemed deeper than usual. Travel fatigue, nothing more. By 1:30 a.m., I was ready for sleep. The room had grown quiet except for the occasional distant rumble of aircraft taking off, and the muffled conversations of other stranded travelers in the hallway. I turned off the bedside lamp and pulled the covers up to my chest, appreciating how the sheets felt cool against my skin. The bed was comfortable, perhaps more so than my own at home, and I found myself sinking into sleep with surprising ease. It was the sensation of movement that woke me, not the jarring awakening of an alarm or sudden noise, but the gradual awareness that something was happening at the foot of the bed. I lay still, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between sleep and consciousness, trying to process what I was feeling. The sheet around my left foot was being manipulated with deliberate precision. I could feel the fabric being lifted, then folded underneath my foot with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. The movement was gentle but firm, creating that perfect hospital corner that only professional housekeeping staff seemed capable of achieving. I felt the slight tug as the sheet was pulled taut, then the satisfying snap of fabric being tucked securely into place. My foot was now encased in a pocket of bedding so precisely formed that it felt like a cocoon. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, trying to process what was happening. The logical part of my mind insisted this was simply a half-dream, the kind of sensory confusion that often accompanied the disorientation of sleeping in unfamiliar places. But the physical sensation was undeniably real. I could feel the exact pressure of the folded sheet against my ankle, the way the fabric held my foot in place with gentle but unmistakable restraint. When the movement stopped, I waited several minutes before opening my eyes. The room was exactly as I'd left it, bathed in the dim glow from the parking garage lights filtering through the curtains. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp, squinting against the sudden brightness. The bed was immaculate. The sheet at the foot of the bed had been folded with the kind of precision that belonged in a five-star hotel, not an airport layover accommodation. The corner was so perfectly formed it could have been photographed for a housekeeping manual. I stared at it for several minutes, my heart rate gradually increasing as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I hadn't requested turn-down service. I specifically remembered declining the offer when I'd checked in, preferring not to be disturbed during my brief stay. Besides, it was nearly 3 a.m., hardly the time for housekeeping rounds. I reached for the phone on the nightstand, hesitating only briefly before dialing the front desk. The phone rang 4 times before a tired voice answered. "Front desk, this is David. How can I help you?" I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of how my question might sound. "Hi, this is room 715. I was wondering if someone from housekeeping came by my room tonight." There was a pause, followed by the sound of keyboard clicking. "Let me check our logs, sir. No, according to our records, housekeeping completed their rounds on your floor at 10 p.m. No one has accessed the 7th floor since approximately 11:30. "Are you certain?" "Someone was in my room, I'm sure of it." More keyboard sounds. "Sir, our card key system tracks all access to guest floors. The only activity recorded for the 7th floor after 11:30 was your own entry at 12:15. Is there a problem with your room?" I looked again at the perfectly folded sheet corner, so precise it seemed to mock my certainty. No problem. Thank you." "Of course, sir. Please don't hesitate to call if you need anything else." I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair. The logical explanation was simple. I had been dreaming. The combination of travel fatigue, an unfamiliar environment, and the stress of missed connections had created a vivid sensory hallucination. People experienced stranger things during periods of sleep deprivation. But as I examined the sheet corner more closely, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The fold was too perfect, too precise for regular hotel housekeeping. This was the work of someone who took extraordinary pride in their craft. Someone who understood the subtle art of bed-making at a level that bordered on obsession. I unfolded the corner, smoothing the sheet back to its original position, then tried to recreate the fold myself. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't achieve even a fraction of the precision I had witnessed. The corners I created were sloppy, uneven, obviously the work of an amateur. Sleep, when it finally came again, was fitful and punctuated by dreams of long hotel corridors that stretched beyond reason and elevators that moved between floors that shouldn't exist. I found myself walking through these dreamscapes with the persistent feeling that I was being followed, though I never saw anyone when I turned around. I woke again at 6:15 a.m., not to an alarm, but to the sensation of movement at the foot of the bed. This time, the experience was different. The sheet wasn't being folded, but rather unfolded with quick, urgent movements. I could feel someone grasping the fabric and pulling it away from my feet with barely contained haste, as if they were trying to rouse me quickly without actually touching me. The tugging was insistent, almost frantic, like a parent trying to wake a child who was in danger of missing something important. The sensation continued for perhaps 30 seconds, the sheet being loosened and adjusted around my feet with increasing urgency. I lay perfectly still, afraid to open my eyes, afraid to breathe too deeply, afraid to do anything that might acknowledge what was happening. The pulling grew more insistent, and I had the distinct impression that whoever was performing this action was growing frustrated with my lack of response. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. I opened my eyes to find the room filled with pale morning light. The bedding at my feet was disheveled, the carefully tucked corners from the night before completely undone. The sheet lay loose around my ankles, as if someone had hastily pulled it free in their eagerness to wake me. The shuttle to the airport terminal ran every 15 minutes, starting at 6:30 a.m. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my phone. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone, or something, had been trying to ensure I didn't miss my transportation. But who? And more importantly, how? I called the front desk again, this time reaching a different clerk who sounded considerably more awake than her overnight counterpart. "Good morning, this is Jennifer. How may I assist you?" "This is room 714. I need to know if anyone has accessed my room during the night. This is very important." I could hear the concern in her voice as she responded. "Sir, I can certainly check our security logs for you. Is everything all right? Do you need security to come to your room?" "Just check the logs, please." The keyboard clicking seemed to last forever. "Sir, according to our records, your room has not been accessed by any hotel staff since housekeeping cleaned it yesterday afternoon. The only card key activity recorded is your own entry last night and, well, that's strange." "What's strange?" "The system shows someone using a master key to access your room at 6:14 a.m. this morning, just a minute before you called. But there's no corresponding entry for anyone coming onto your floor, and none of our staff are scheduled to be on 7 until the afternoon shift." My mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure, sir. This might be a system error. Let me get my manager and we'll send security up to check on you right away." I told her that wouldn't be necessary, that I was checking out in a few minutes anyway, but she insisted. While I waited, I packed my bag with hands that shook slightly, glancing repeatedly at the foot of the bed where the evidence of the night's disturbances remained clearly visible in the disheveled bedding. Security arrived in the form of a tired-looking man in his 50s who examined my room with professional thoroughness. He checked the windows, the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed. He found nothing out of place except for what he described as unusually precise housekeeping work on the previous evening. "Sometimes the night staff take extra pride in their work," he explained, though his expression suggested he found this explanation as unsatisfying as I did. "We've had a few reports over the years of guests experiencing unusual service. Nothing harmful, just very thorough attention to detail." "Other reports?" He hesitated, glancing around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Let's just say you're not the first guest to call about unexpected housekeeping visits. Management prefers we don't discuss it, but between you and me, room 714 has a bit of a reputation." I left the hotel that morning with more questions than answers, my mind churning with possibilities as the shuttle carried me toward the terminal. The other passengers seemed oblivious to my internal turmoil, focused on their phones or staring out the windows at the morning traffic. I envied their certainty, their comfortable existence in a world where beds didn't make themselves and sheets didn't move without human intervention. During the flight to Tampa, I found myself researching the hotel online, searching for reviews that might mention similar experiences. What I found was a pattern of reports buried among the standard comments about comfortable beds and convenient location. Guests describing exceptional housekeeping attention, unexpected room service, and the feeling of being very well cared for during their stay. One review, posted just 3 weeks earlier, caught my attention. "I've stayed in hundreds of hotels during my travel career, but I've never experienced service quite like this. Someone clearly takes incredible pride in their work at this establishment. I felt like I was being watched over during my entire stay, in the best possible way. My only complaint is that I never had the chance to thank the staff member responsible personally." Another from 6 months ago. "The housekeeping staff here are absolutely dedicated to their craft. I woke up on multiple occasions to find my room being attended to with a level of precision that bordered on artistic. While some might find this intrusive, I appreciated the attention to detail. Just be aware that the service here is extremely thorough." By the time I landed in Tampa, I had found dozens of similar reports spanning back several years. All described exceptional housekeeping service, attention to detail that exceeded normal standards, and the persistent feeling of being carefully attended to throughout their stays. None mentioned seeing the staff member responsible. What disturbed me most was the consistency of the reports. They all described experiences that were positive, but somehow unsettling. Service that was helpful, but inappropriately intimate. and they all came from room 714. I tried to put the experience behind me, focusing on the work that had brought me to Florida in the first place. But late at night, lying in my own bed in my own house, I found myself thinking about those perfectly folded sheet corners and the urgent tugging that had awakened me precisely 15 minutes before the shuttle arrived. The rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate. Sleep deprivation couldn't account for the physical evidence I had witnessed. System errors couldn't explain the master key access recorded at the exact moment I had felt the sheet being manipulated. And coincidence couldn't rationalize the timing of my awakening. 3 weeks later, I had another layover in Charlotte. Different circumstances this time. A delayed connection to Boston rather than Tampa, but the same hotel, the same need for a room for the night. When I called to make a reservation, I specifically requested a room on a different floor. "I'm sorry, sir," the reservation agent told me, "but due to a convention in town, we only have availability on the 7th floor. Room 714 is available if you'd like it. Our records show you stayed there previously." I sat in the hotel lobby for an hour after checking in, studying the other guests and trying to identify which of them might be responsible for the meticulous housekeeping I had experienced. The staff I observed seemed normal, professional but unremarkable. They performed their duties with competent efficiency, but nothing about their demeanor suggested the obsessive attention to detail I had witnessed. Room 714 looked exactly as I remembered it. Same beige walls, same mass-produced artwork, same precisely made bed with its mathematical corners and perfectly aligned pillows. I unpacked with deliberate slowness, trying to memorize every detail of the room's current state so I could detect any changes that might occur during the night. This time, I was prepared. I set up my phone to record video, positioning it on the desk with a clear view of the foot of the bed. I placed small pieces of tape at various points on the bedding to serve as indicators of movement. I even left a note on the nightstand. "Thank you for your exceptional service. I would appreciate the opportunity to meet you personally." I went to sleep at midnight, my phone recording, my makeshift monitoring system in place, my mind alert despite my body's exhaustion. I woke at 3:22 a.m. to the familiar sensation of the sheet being manipulated around my foot. But this time, I was ready. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, while mentally noting every detail of the experience. The movements were identical to what I had felt during my previous stay. The same gentle precision, the same professional technique, the same perfectly executed hospital corner. When the activity stopped, I waited 5 minutes before carefully opening my eyes. The bed had been arranged with the same impossible precision I remembered, but my tape indicators remained undisturbed. My phone continued recording from its position on the desk, capturing nothing but an empty room bathed in dim light. But the note I had left on the nightstand was gone. In its place was a hotel stationery card with a message written in meticulous handwriting. "Some guests require more attention than others. Your comfort has been ensured. Pleasant dreams." I checked my phone immediately, reviewing the hours of footage I had captured. The video showed me sleeping peacefully in an undisturbed room. No movement, no figures, no activity of any kind. According to the digital record, nothing had happened in room 714 except for a tired traveler getting a good night's sleep. But the evidence was undeniable. The perfectly folded sheet, the missing note, the reply written in handwriting that belonged to no one I had seen in the hotel. Someone with access to my room, someone invisible to electronic surveillance, someone who took professional pride in ensuring their guests were properly cared for. The next morning, as I packed my bag for the final time, I found myself wondering about the nature of service and the people who provide it. Hotels are temporary spaces designed to accommodate the needs of strangers who pass through like ghosts, leaving behind only the record of their credit card transactions and the impression their bodies make on carefully prepared beds. But what about those who remain? What about the people who dedicate their lives to ensuring that these temporary spaces feel like home, who take pride in details that most guests never notice, who continue their work long after their shifts have ended and their names have been forgotten? As the shuttle carried me away from the Charlotte Airport Marriott for what I assumed would be the final time, I looked back at the 7-story building and wondered which window belonged to room 714. I wondered if someone was watching me leave. Someone who took satisfaction in knowing they had once again successfully ensured a guest's comfort and timely departure. Most of all, I wondered if I would ever understand the difference between exceptional service and something else entirely. Something that exists in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between the need for care and the reality of solitude, between the comfort of being attended to and the terror of never being truly alone. The answer, I suspect, depends entirely on whether you're grateful for the attention or disturbed by its implications. Whether you see it as dedication to craft or something more complex, something that defies the normal boundaries between service and intrusion, between helpful and haunting. I never stayed in room 714 again, but I still think about it. And sometimes, lying in my own bed in my own house, I find myself missing the certainty that someone was watching over me, ensuring my comfort with an attention to detail that bordered on devotion. Sometimes I even find myself wishing that my own sheets were folded with such perfect precision that someone cared enough about my rest to make certain I woke up exactly when I needed to. But mostly, I try not to think about the handwriting on that note, or the fact that it looked remarkably similar to my own. Story 9. The spare key felt heavier than it should have when I turned it in the lock of my cousin's new place. 3 months since he'd moved to Portland for his residency, and I was the first family member to visit. The house stood narrow and tall among its neighbors, painted a faded blue that seemed to absorb rather than reflect, the October light filtering through the massive oak trees lining the street. Inside, the air carried that particular staleness of a place still settling into itself. Fresh paint mixing with old wood, new carpet fighting against decades of other people's lives. My cousin had warned me the place came partially furnished, remnants left behind by previous tenants who'd apparently vanished without much notice. As I climbed the steep staircase to the second floor, each step announced itself with a distinct groan, like the house was commenting on my presence. The room he'd given me sat at the back of the house, tucked under the slanted roof. A single window looked out over a small backyard dominated by an ancient maple whose branches scraped against the glass whenever the wind picked up. The furniture was sparse but functional. A twin bed with a metal frame, a wooden dresser with brass handles gone green with age, and a small desk positioned directly under the window. What struck me most was the ceiling, low enough that I had to duck slightly when standing near the bed, with exposed wooden beams that cast long shadows even in daylight. That first afternoon, I unpacked my bag and tried to shake off the weird feeling that had been growing since I'd entered the house. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint exactly, just a persistent sense that the spaces around me were somehow smaller than they appeared, as if the walls were slowly, imperceptibly drawing closer together. I chalked it up to travel fatigue and the adjustment to being in an unfamiliar place. My cousin wouldn't be back until late. His rotation had him pulling consecutive 12-hour shifts, so I spent the evening exploring the house and ordering takeout. The kitchen felt normal enough, though the refrigerator hummed with an irregular rhythm that kept catching my attention. The living room seemed fine during daylight, but as evening approached, the shadows in the corners began to feel too deep, too persistent, remaining dark even when I turned on every lamp in the room. By 10 o'clock, I was exhausted enough to ignore my growing unease. I'd always been sensitive to new environments. It usually took me a few nights to sleep well in strange places. I figured this wouldn't be any different. I was wrong. The room felt different in darkness, not just because I couldn't see properly, but because the very quality of the space seemed to shift once I turned off the bedside lamp. The air became thicker, more resistant, like trying to breathe through gauze. I lay on my stomach, face pressed into the pillow that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, and tried to convince myself that the unfamiliar sounds were just the house settling. Then I felt the touch. Cold fingers, definitely fingers, gently parted the hair at the nape of my neck. The touch was precise, deliberate, as if someone were trying to locate something specific. Not violent or aggressive, but clinical in its methodology. The fingers felt real. I could sense the slight ridges of fingerprints, the cool temperature of skin that hadn't seen warmth in a long time. They moved in small sections, lifting strands of hair, pausing as if measuring or mapping, then moving to the next section. My first instinct was to whip around, but something about the touch paralyzed me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange certainty that turning around would be the wrong thing to do. Instead, I remained motionless, every nerve ending hyper-aware, as those cold fingers continued their methodical exploration of my neck and the base of my skull. The touching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I waited several heartbeats before slowly rolling over, my eyes immediately drawn upward. What I saw on the ceiling directly above the bed defied easy description. It wasn't quite shadow, and wasn't quite substance, but rather an accumulation of darkness that seemed to have weight and density. It moved in rhythm with my breathing, expanding when I inhaled, contracting when I exhaled, like some grotesque lung feeding off my own respiratory system. I lay there for what felt like hours, watching this thing pulse and shift above me. Every time I thought it might be my imagination, some trick of insufficient light filtering through the window, it would react to my breath in such a synchronized way that I couldn't dismiss it. When I held my breath, it went completely still. When I breathed rapidly, it fluttered and rippled like water disturbed by wind. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I must have fallen asleep because I woke to gray morning light and an empty ceiling. Downstairs, I found my cousin's aunt, a woman in her 60s who lived next door and checked on the house periodically, making coffee in the kitchen. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen and explained that she'd noticed I'd arrived and wanted to make sure I had everything I needed. We sat at the small kitchen table, and she asked how I'd slept. I mentioned that the house had a lot of character, which made her laugh, though not in a particularly pleasant way. Character, yes. That's one way to put it. She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Your cousin probably didn't mention the renovation work they did before he moved in. Had some troubles with it. She went on to explain that the previous tenants had left abruptly, forfeiting their security deposit rather than finishing out their lease. The landlord had decided to do some updates, new paint, carpet, minor repairs. But the work crew ran into problems. One of the workers, a roofer, took a bad fall right off the top of the house, landed in the backyard, broke his leg in 2 places. But the strange thing was, after they got him patched up, he refused to come back and finish the job, wouldn't even come inside to collect his tools. His crew had to bring everything out to him. She paused, studying my face. He kept saying something was wrong with the weight distribution up there, that the ceiling in the back bedroom wasn't stable. But when they had an inspector come out, everything checked fine, structurally sound. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the rhythmic expansion and contraction I'd witnessed the night before. Since then, Mrs. Chen continued, that room makes the oddest sounds, like someone walking around up there, testing where to step. Always at night, always the same pattern. As if summoned by her words, a distinct creaking sound echoed from somewhere above us. We both looked up at the ceiling, and Mrs. Chen shook her head. There it goes again. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Old houses made noises. Everyone knew that. Wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Shadows played tricks in insufficient light. The human brain was remarkably adept at finding patterns where none existed, especially when primed by suggestion and unfamiliar surroundings. But as evening approached, my rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. That second night, I left the bedside lamp on. The gesture felt childish, but I told myself it was just practical. If I woke up confused about my surroundings, at least I'd be able to orient myself quickly. The light didn't help. If anything, it made the experience more disturbing because I could see everything clearly. The cold fingers returned around midnight, this time starting at my left shoulder and working their way across the back of my neck with that same methodical precision. In the lamplight, I could see my hair moving as the invisible fingers lifted and separated each strand, though I couldn't see what was doing the moving. When I finally worked up the courage to turn over, the thing on the ceiling was not only visible, but more defined than the night before. It had developed what looked like texture, not smooth darkness anymore, but something that suggested depth and layering, like looking up through murky water at something floating just below the surface. And it was bigger. The dark mass now covered nearly a quarter of the ceiling, extending from directly above the bed toward the window. As I watched, frozen with a terror that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and settle directly into my bones, the thing began to pulse more rapidly, as if excited by my attention. Then I heard the footsteps. They started somewhere above the ceiling and moved in a deliberate pattern from one end of the room to the other. Not the random creaking Mrs. Chen had described, but purposeful movement. Someone or something was walking back and forth up there, pausing at regular intervals as if testing the floor's stability before taking the next step. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour, growing more confident with each pass. By the time they finally stopped, the dark mass on the ceiling had expanded to cover nearly half the space above me, and I could swear I saw what looked like indentations forming in its surface, as if something heavy were pressing down from above. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I called my cousin at the hospital. I tried to keep my tone casual as I asked about his experiences in the house, particularly in the back bedroom. He admitted he'd been sleeping on the living room couch since moving in, claiming the bedroom felt off in ways he couldn't quite explain. When I pressed him for details, he became evasive, eventually suggesting that maybe the house just needed time to get used to having people in it again. That evening, I seriously considered finding a hotel. The only thing that stopped me was the growing certainty that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the house. It was connected to me specifically. The way the thing on the ceiling responded to my breathing, the targeted nature of the touching, the timing of the footsteps all suggested something that had taken a particular interest in my presence. Leaving felt like abandoning some essential piece of information, like walking away from a puzzle just before solving it. The third night, I decided to conduct an experiment. I positioned myself on the bed with a small digital recorder I'd brought for work meetings. If the sounds were real, they'd register on the device. If they were hallucinations brought on by stress or unfamiliar surroundings, the recorder would capture only silence. What it captured was worse than either option. The cold touches began earlier that night, around 11:30, and this time they were accompanied by what sounded like whispered counting. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Someone or something was using numbers to map out sections of my neck and head. The ceiling entity appeared almost immediately after the touching began, and for the first time, I noticed that its movements weren't just synchronized with my breathing. They were anticipating it, expanding a split second before I inhaled, contracting just before I exhaled, as if it were somehow controlling my respiratory system rather than responding to it. The footsteps started around 1 a.m., but they were different this time. Instead of the careful testing pattern from previous nights, they moved with purpose and increasing speed, as if whatever was up there had finally found what it was looking for. When I played back the recording the next morning, I heard my own breathing, clear and regular. I heard the creaking of the bed frame when I shifted position, but where the footsteps and whispered counting should have been, there was only silence. The absence of sound on the recording was somehow more terrifying than any documentation would have been. It meant either the phenomena were entirely in my head, which raised questions about my mental state that I wasn't prepared to confront, or they were real but existed outside the normal parameters of what electronic devices could detect. I found myself hoping for insanity. On the fourth day, Mrs. Chen knocked on the door with a plate of homemade cookies, and what she claimed was a casual question about how I was settling in. But I could see the concern in her eyes as she studied my face, taking in what I knew were the obvious signs of sleep deprivation and stress. During our conversation, she mentioned that the previous tenants had also complained about disturbances in the back bedroom. They'd described feeling watched, hearing sounds that couldn't be explained, and experiencing what they called intrusive contact during the night. The landlord had dismissed their concerns as anxiety related to moving into an older home, but when they'd left so abruptly, he'd had the house thoroughly inspected. Everything checked out, Mrs. Chen said, echoing what she'd told me before. Structurally sound, no pest problems, no obvious sources for strange noises. But the inspector did mention something odd about the ceiling in that room. She paused, clearly debating whether to continue. He said the wood up there showed stress patterns that didn't match the age of the house, like something heavy had been resting on it for a long time. even though the attic space above is completely empty. That night, I made a decision that in retrospect seems either incredibly brave or profoundly stupid. Instead of lying down and waiting for the phenomena to begin, I positioned myself on the floor directly below where the dark mass typically appeared and stared up at the ceiling. What happened next challenged every assumption I'd developed about the nature of reality. The cold fingers found me immediately, but this time they didn't stop at my neck. They traced the outline of my entire body, working with that same methodical precision, but covering much more ground. As they moved, I began to understand what they were doing. They were measuring me, not just my physical dimensions, but something else. Something about the space I occupied, the way I displaced air, the particular frequency of my breathing and heartbeat. It felt like being examined by something that needed to understand exactly how much room I required to exist. Above me, the dark mass began to take on more definition. What I'd initially interpreted as shapeless density started to reveal structure, not quite human, but organized in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. It lowered itself slowly, maintaining its pulsing rhythm, but gradually reducing the distance between us. As it descended, the footsteps overhead became more frantic, as if whatever was up there was running out of time. The sounds moved in rapid patterns now, crisscrossing the ceiling space with increasing desperation. Then I understood. The thing on the ceiling wasn't some separate entity. It was the shadow of whatever was walking above, somehow projected through the wooden beams and into the room below. And the measurements, the careful mapping of my physical space, weren't random exploration. They were preparation. The dark mass continued its descent, now close enough that I could feel a cold emanation against my skin. The whispered counting returned, but this time I could almost make out the words. They weren't in English, but the cadence was familiar, like someone reading off measurements or coordinates. In that moment, I realized that the worker who'd fallen from the roof hadn't been the victim of an accident. He'd been running from something that had been trying to do to him exactly what was happening to me now. The stress patterns in the ceiling wood weren't from the weight of stored belongings or structural settling. They were from something that had been using the attic space to practice, to prepare, to gradually work up the courage for this moment. The dark mass was now less than 2 feet above me, and I could see details that made my stomach clench with primal terror. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't empty either. It was like looking at space that had been carved out of reality itself, a void that contained all the properties of matter without any of the substance. And it was reaching for me. Not with visible appendages, but with extensions of that impossible emptiness, trying to wrap around me the same way those cold fingers had been mapping my boundaries. I could feel it pulling, not at my body, but at something deeper, the space I occupied, the particular way I fit into the world. I rolled away just as the thing made contact with the floor where I'd been lying. The impact made no sound, but I felt it through the boards beneath me, a vibration that seemed to occur in dimensions I couldn't name. The footsteps overhead stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of wood splintering, coming from somewhere above the ceiling. I spent the rest of that night crammed into the narrow space behind the bedroom door, listening to the systematic destruction of whatever was in the attic above. It wasn't violent or angry destruction, but methodical, purposeful, like someone dismantling a structure they no longer needed. By morning, the sounds had stopped. When my cousin returned that afternoon, I was packed and ready to leave. I tried to explain what had happened, but he seemed more concerned about my obvious exhaustion and stressed mental state than about the details of my story. He walked through the house with me, noting that everything appeared normal, and suggested that maybe I'd been pushing myself too hard at work and needed some real rest. Standing in that bedroom in broad daylight, with sunlight streaming through the window and ordinary household sounds drifting in from the street, my own account seemed impossible. The ceiling looked perfectly normal, just exposed wooden beams and the typical shadows they cast. No dark masses, no stress patterns, no signs of anything unusual. But when I looked more closely at the beams themselves, I noticed something my cousin had missed. There were fresh marks in the wood, shallow indentations arranged in patterns that looked almost like footprints. They led from one end of the ceiling to the other, concentrated most heavily directly above where the bed was positioned. As we prepared to leave the room, I heard it one more time, a single, soft creak from somewhere above the ceiling. Not random settling, but deliberate. Purposeful. My cousin didn't seem to hear it. I've been back home for 3 weeks now, and I still wake up several times each night, automatically checking the ceiling above my bed. My own apartment feels different somehow, as if the experience in that house changed something fundamental